Awesome. All right. Welcome to session 5 of the Timber Products Output session. The theme for today is identifying users' emerging needs. And here's our basic rules again for everyone who may be just joining us. Pretty simple here. Again, keep that chat going. I know everyone has appreciated the hearty chat that's been going on and the great ideas that you all have had. So I encourage you to keep that going. And then also to note again that the CFE credits will be recorded at the end of each session. Something different about this session today is we're doing a break in the middle of the session. So if you do want CFE credits, you're going to have to stick around for the whole session. Just a note about that. The other note is that we'll be having a new moderator pop in to do the discussion at the end. So my colleague Rich Goulden will be helping us out. So I just wanted to intro Rich and just let him wave if he wants to. Otherwise, we'll see him later. There's Rich. Welcome, Rich. All right. Again, I'll note that all the sessions are also being recorded and that the recordings have, some of the recordings have already been posted on the site. So go ahead and go back if you missed anything. We've also done a nice job. Thank you to presenters for sending over your PowerPoints or for uploading them yourselves. So there's a lot of extra documents up on that site as well if people would like to check those out. So with that, I think we're gonna get Nadia Tace queued up here for her presentation. So Nadia, I'll stop sharing. Let you take over.
Okay. All right, can everyone see my slides?
We can.
Yes.
All right. So I'm Nadia Tace. I work for CAL FIRE in the Fire and Resource Assessment Program, and I'll be presenting to you today on how we've been using TPO data to look at carbon and harvested wood products. So currently our forest ecosystem portion of the inventory is handled through the PNW research station based on the FIA data. But for harvested wood products, in the spring of 2018, CAL FIRE held a wood products carbon workshop during which the researchers from the University of Montana, Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and the Forest Service presented methods and data sources that they used for estimating harvested wood product carbon for the Forest Service regions. And that was published, one of the papers was published by Stockman et al. In the Carbon Balance and Management Journal. And so Dan Leffler, Nate Anderson, and Todd Morgan were really instrumental in putting this workshop on for us and explaining the methods and the data sources, several of which are grounded in TPO data, and how they could be modified for a state level estimate rather than at the national level or at the forest level as had been done in the past. And so any one of them can certainly speak about all of that much better, but I'll be presenting today from the user side. So beginning with our 2017 full report, we were able to include methods and estimates for harvested wood product carbon in California, and we modified the original accounting tool used for the Stockman work to accommodate our state level reporting. There were also representatives from Oregon and Washington at the workshop, and since then those states have also developed state level estimates, and I think those are pretty close to publication. Oh, and I forgot to mention the reason there was a rabbit on the beginning slide is because we're going to journey down some rabbit holes. So we are using the IPCC production approach, meaning that we are addressing carbon in harvested wood products from California origin timber. So exports are included, but imports are excluded. And we use annual timber harvest data, timber product and primary product ratios, and a variety of other data to provide these estimates of commercial harvested wood product carbon for products in use, products at solid waste disposal site, and products that are burned or emitted with and without energy capture. These estimates do not include carbon associated with byproduct utilization, such as bark, nor do the estimates include avoided emissions from actual or potential wood energy and material substitution. So before I get into the data sets, I'm just going to look at the schematic from Stockman et al. And describe the general flow to calculate harvested wood product carbon stocks. So using timber product ratios, annual timber harvest volumes are allocated to timber product classes, which those will be your products before milling, your hard and softwood saw logs, pulpwood, etc. And your timber products are then allocated to primary products using the primary product ratios. And so those primary products will be your lumber, veneer, plywood, etc. And then at that point, we are converting the volumes of primary products to carbon and then distributing the carbon to various end uses using the end use ratios. So the end uses will be categories like single family homes, furniture, packaging and shipping. And in a major simplification, we then apply end use product half-lives, discard ratios, and discard half-lives to determine the amount of carbon remaining in the wood products in use pool or moved for storage into products at solid waste disposal sites or associated with the products emitted or burned with and without energy capture. So the reason I say, we're on going down some rabbit holes is I've really been on a mission to round up all the data sets and sources used in our wood products carbon accounting and get a better understanding of who is or has been responsible for creating them, updating them, determining whether or not they really are state or regionally specific or better suited for national data sets. And in general, there's two main publications that get cited, Smith et al. 2006 and Skog 2008, but then they have a lot of other citations for their data sources. And so that's where the rabbit holes begin. And then you'll see on these slides that I specifically call out California and Oregon. And that's because we've been developing our state level inventories, working closely together. And so I just provide that information for the folks that we've been working with. And I'll also say that these slides are ugly. There's a ton of information on them for folks interested in state level wood products carbon accounting. But I'd say to use these more for reference rather than trying to read them all during the presentation. I'm also sort of hoping that someone at the Forest Service will take the questions in these slides about when data sets will be updated or if regional data sets can be developed and then run with it, because I don't know how that will happen. So our annual harvest data is required for wood products carbon estimates, and that'll obviously be specific to where you're trying to do your analysis. And because carbon can be stored for a long time in products in use and at solid waste disposal sites, we try to include historic harvest for as far back as we have data for. So this data set relies heavily on TPO data, and Dan Leffler and Todd Morgan and others had amassed harvest data by ownership going back to 1952 in California, looking at a variety of the reports listed here. Going forward, we use the University of Montana BBER Harvest by County tool, which encompasses several of the data sources that are compiled on this list, and they cite all of their sources at that tool. The data set is updated annually for California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana, and Todd Morgan and Kate Marciel and others could certainly tell you much more about the effort that goes into compiling those data for those states, and I'm sure that there are experts from other regions of the country as well that can speak about those data sources. From the presentations yesterday, it sounds like there are a variety of data visualization and download tools in the works for TPO nationally. So it should be easy to compile a list of where folks could access these data if there are other states interested in doing this sort of work. So then on to our timber product ratios. That's also required for the accounting and should be as specific as possible to the area of harvest. These data sets, along with the harvest volumes, really must be determined by the user of the accounting tool that we have. And these ratios were derived from various historic and current timber product output reports. And in our case, the BBER Forest Industry Data Collection System. And this data set can be anticipated to be updated with the release of new TPO reports on an approximate 5-year basis. And it's my understanding that the level of detail in the annual TPO will not be enough to update these ratios annually, but that's certainly something for the TPO folks to consider. So our primary product ratios are derived from the same literature as the timber product ratios, and states that are interested in wood products carbon accounting can develop their own primary product ratios if they want to, but the original model used by Stockman and others provided default ratios for the National Forest System regions, and that can be used by the states. And those defaults are based on Table D6 in Smith et al. 2006, which is based on another publication, and so that's where you start to get the daisy chain of citations for data sources. And it's really been a challenge for me to get to the bottom of all of that, but these slides kind of represent a best attempt at getting all of those sources in line. And in the end use ratios, there are several other data sets that we're using, and I'm going to just talk about them briefly in the interest of time, but we have end use ratios, and those are based on a national data set that came out of the Forest Products Lab in 2011. And, I think the folks that worked on that are retired now, so I'm not sure what the plan is for updating those ratios. And it's not something I think that needs to be updated, frequently, but it will be especially important when we start to have, emerging innovative products really entering the scene and potentially changing ratios or adding, new end use categories. End use product half-lives are essentially national data sets at this point, and the ones we're using are coming from Smith et al. 2006, which then cites other papers listed here. But it actually appears in our accounting tool that some of the values are actually coming from IPCC, and they weren't cited that way. So those are some of the rabbit holes I'm trying to get down and get the citations in order. And then additionally, SCOG 2008 included newer analysis for half-lives that was not incorporated into our data sets. And so there's some digging that I'm trying to do on figuring out what the best source of information is on that. It's, very minor variations, but it's just good to be clear. So our discard ratios are the ratios that will allocate products and use to various discard categories like burned, recycled, composted, landfilled, or dumped. And that is coming from SCOG 2008, which again cites other work. And these data can be applied nationally, although it's likely that state or regionally specific data may exist. I know there's a lot of data collection on waste streams in California, but I have not yet been able to dive into those. Our discard half-lives for materials at landfills and dumps come from SCOG 2008, which then actually cites IPCC for those values. And our report and similar work cites SCOG 2008 for our discard half-lives for recycled material, but actually the value used in our tool and the original tool seems to match the paper half-life in Smith et al. 2006. And that makes sense logically, but just trying to, again, get all the ducks in a row on the citations. So our landfill fixed carbon ratio, which will basically say how much of our discarded material will remain in landfills indefinitely. It comes from SCOG 2008, which again cites other work for those values. And then our accounting tool accounts for discarded material burned for energy. And currently that value is set to 0. I think there may be data out there, just nobody has really compiled that for this application at this point. And I can see there's a lot of stuff coming up in the chat, but I'm not able to capture all of that. So our board foot Scribner to cubic foot conversions are super important for these calculations, and those obviously rely heavily on the TPO data. Most of our harvest data in our time series is in board feet, but the model is running calculations on CCF, and so we have specific data sets for California and Oregon, and then I believe the original tool provides defaults for the other National Forest Service regions. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier that harvest volumes are allocated to timber products and then to primary products. And then primary product volumes are converted to carbon. And this is done using primary product volume to carbon conversions from table D1 in Smith et al. 2006. But again, because the accounting tool we use uses volumes in CCF, the conversions we use are all based on converting those primary product volumes in CCF to metric tons of carbon. And so table D1 in Smith et al. Has primary product volumes in various units. So the conversions in that table have to be converted to the standard units we're using in our accounting tool. And this was super confusing to me as to why our values in our tool weren't matching table D1. And I recently sorted it out. And so there's an example on this slide showing how the GTR shows that there's 0.236 metric tons of carbon per 1,000 square feet of softwood plywood on a 3/8 inch basis. And then our model is using 0.75 metric tons of carbon per CCF of softwood plywood. And once you do all the conversions, it all makes sense, but it just takes a moment to figure out what's going on there. And I'll be curious how some of the work presented yesterday on the roundwood conversions and variations by state may actually affect these conversion factors. But ultimately, there's a lot of work that goes into gathering these data sources for California and making them compatible with each other. And it really couldn't have been done without the help of everyone at the University of Montana, BBER, when we started doing all this work in California. So here's just some quick examples of the outputs that we get when we do our carbon accounting. We can provide the timber product output in million metric tons of carbon, and we can compare that to the FIA cut. And so we were showing with our FIA data that there was 3.7 million metric tons of carbon cut out of the forest, and 2.7 of that was associated with commercial harvest. So that's exciting that kind of makes sense, because we expect, not everything that gets cut comes out of the forest. And then we can also show our cumulative carbon stocks and emissions. And we have this for our, our historic time series. And in California, our carbon stocks for wood products are about 135 million metric tons. And our ecosystem stocks are around 3,070 million metric tons of carbon. So that's about approximately 4% of our total carbon stock. And then we can also show net change. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this figure either, but our net change in our wood products carbon pools is about 3% of our total net change when we include the forest ecosystem. So other uses of TPO, I mentioned earlier, our accounting doesn't include bark at this point. It's not really considered a commercial harvest product, and it's not a long-lived carbon storage pool, but we are using the heck out of it in California, and so the emissions really might be important for other greenhouse gas inventory sectors. And so I think Todd and Kate have added this bark Christmas tree to our TPO reports, and it makes us really happy. We've also done a sawmill energy use study, and that was completed with an additional questionnaire added onto our 2016 sawmill census. And it's really nice because we can get the energy profile of our sawmill industry, and we can see that the majority of their energy is coming from wood, and we can calculate the associated CO2 emissions with that. And so of the sawmill CO2 emissions, 92% of those emissions came from wood, with fossil fuels making up approximately 8% of the emissions. And those emissions, when we compare it to what we're sequestering in the forest sector, the wood emissions are about 3% of the total CO2 we're sequestering in our forest sector, and the fossil fuel emissions are approximately 0.2%. And so it's just nice to get that breakdown and kind of understand what the carbon footprint of our sawmill energy use is. We also were able to get an estimate of the logging residue associated with commercial harvest. So we had about 907,000 bone-dry tons of logging residue. And we were able to get the emissions profile if all of those residues were burned on site. And then they also did some extra calculations to determine the energy content. And so I think they found that we had enough energy to power all of the 16 sawmills that were surveyed entirely, with some leftover. But of course, that's not necessarily, feasible because some of their energy needs really come from, rolling stock equipment that needs fossil fuels. So, it's not like we can really make that swap exactly. But I get asked this question a lot because there's a lot of people who want to use the material that's out there and not burn it on site for a variety of reasons. And then we're also using TPO for an updated California logging utilization study. We're getting a lot of information out of that, but a couple of new things that we added was a dead tree analysis. Just we have so much dead trees, from fire and drought and all that, and so they added a salvage component to the study this time. And we'll also hopefully get some more, answers about the amount of residue out there and the fate of the residue, and be able to provide those answers to our stakeholders. And then lastly, I want to mention the Pacific Coast Temperate Forest Regional Carbon Report. We'll be reporting on forest and harvested wood product carbon in California, Oregon, Washington, and BC. And this report will serve as a monitoring baseline as the forests in this region continue to be impacted by climate change and as these jurisdictions aim to leverage forests and climate mitigation. And so one of the interesting parts of this report will be the timber and finished wood product flow analysis to help us understand how wood is moving within and beyond this region, which will help us understand potential leakage that might already be occurring or that may occur with different forest management and utilization scenarios. So, for example, we suspect California is importing 80 to 90% of our wood products. And we suspect that this is mostly coming from British Columbia, but we just don't have a recent report documenting any of this. And we could be totally wrong in our assumptions, and maybe we're getting all of our wood from, the super carbon dense and biodiverse Amazon, which may or may not be getting harvested sustainably. So it's important for us to understand, the wood movement. And then also, if California explored a policy decision to try and meet wood demand through local harvest, we want to understand what kind of negative impacts that might have. So if we are, for example, getting a lot of our wood from BC and then we start, producing our own, which I think is highly unlikely, but just putting it out there as an idea, then maybe we would negatively impact BC's timber industry, and then all of their forest land might convert to farms or, pot farms or something, I don't know. But just, some things out there that we're trying to explore. And we're really excited about the work that Todd Morgan and Tolly Dillon are doing on the timber flow work, and Sam Evans and Matthew Potts from UC Berkeley are doing on the finished wood products flow. And so I mentioned the other day that the finished wood products flow analysis will provide some data on interstate flows for the rest of the country. And so I don't know that they'll be reporting on that in our report, but have some data sets. So I'm sure if folks are interested, they could reach out to any of us on that. And so that's all I have for you all. And thanks for letting me share some of this information.
Thanks, Nadia. Since we're right up on the minute for the next presentation, I'm going to ask maybe if Michael can bring up his presentation. There are a couple comments for you in the chat that I see, so feel free to check those out. And then, if there's time before the break, we can go to questions, or of course, again, there's a discussion section at the end of this session. So I encourage you all to think of questions. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Michael Gergen with the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and learn from you for the last couple of days. I've been learning a lot about TPO, and it's been refining my thoughts on ways that we might utilize this data and find ways to collaborate going forward in different and new ways. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our work on life cycle analysis, what we're doing with partners on developing environmental product declarations, and how TPO and really ultimately the FIA program really fit into this, and how critical and important all of these pieces are together to get to some of the kinds of solutions that people are looking for from forest products to both provide solutions for carbon sequestration, more sustainability, and really a lot of challenges that we're facing throughout the world. What's interesting to me is that, this next slide here that I'm showing you, you're probably thinking, why on earth are we looking at this from a TPO standpoint, right? So these are some of the largest companies in the world. And what's interesting about them is they have a number of things in common. If you look at their total market capitalization, it's well over $8 trillion. But more interestingly, all of them have committed to build with wood going forward, and they see building with wood as a climate change solution for them. They've all made commitments about reducing their carbon footprint, and they would like to use wood as a part of the solutions that they see to be able to reduce that carbon footprint. Microsoft in particular has said they're going to actually reduce the amount of carbon emissions from their entire operations for the lifetime of the company. So there's some real challenges here, and the great thing is that they're looking to forests for solutions for the challenges that they're facing. But they all want real assurances that what they're purchasing, what they're buying in terms of products, what they're purchasing in terms of carbon credits are sustainable, and they're really leading to the kinds of carbon sequestration that folks are looking for and are promising through some of these programs and services that we offer in our sector to others who are looking for these carbon solutions. So interestingly enough, if you look at how big these companies really are, the fourth quarter of 2020, Microsoft put about $16.5 billion just in the bank. That's just money that they put aside and actually just saved. That's 65% of Weyerhaeuser's total market capitalization, and Weyerhaeuser is the largest landowner, private landowner in the United States. You know, the size of this is absolutely incredible. They could take the change that they find from the couches in the Googleplex and buy a company like Weyerhaeuser and sequester all of that carbon that's on that forest land. And that isn't necessarily a great solution for forests, but that's the kind of buying power that these folks really have. And so we've got a lot of work to do to try to work with them to convince them that the solutions that we're offering really are sustainable. So, you know, just to follow up a little further on this, you know, Google has actually made a commitment of a fund of $1 billion to provide sustainable housing just in the Silicon Valley. Lend-Lease, which is a nationwide builder of all kinds of different types of buildings, but they have $15 billion already committed in mass timber projects. And, you know, Walmart's campus that they're building out in Arkansas is about 300 acres total. It's going to house 17,000 employees, and it's a mass timber solution. That's what they're looking for. That's what they're building. In fact, there actually has been an investment of a CLT manufacturer in Arkansas just to meet the demand of this particular starting project. So really exciting times for using wood in the built environment, wood as a carbon solution. And what does that mean for TPO and the work that all of you are doing to help us understand all the outputs that are coming from the forest sector? Excuse me. So this leads us to life cycle analysis, LCA. Life cycle analysis is this really study of the environmental aspects of materials. And so what we're trying to do is look from cradle to grave types of solutions. And why this is important is it tries to start to help us be able to compare materials against each other so that we can understand which choice is the best one for a particular type of building, solution, the kinds of things that folks are looking for these carbon storage opportunities. So, you know, how do we actually go about collecting LCA data for forest products? Anybody know? We survey mill managers. And so once again, you know, here we are with a similar challenge that we've got with some of the work that you've all been talking about with the TPO program. The LCA data is also collected through a mill manager survey. And that's really what I want to talk to you all about a little bit today, is how we might be able to find some opportunities from collaboration, opportunities to enhance some of these solutions so that we reduce some of the burdens that we're placing on folks that are filling out these surveys for us. Now, these LCA data actually wind up getting us to environmental product declarations, which again is, you know, a consumer-facing way so that we can show that LCA information so people can begin to compare products when trying to make choices. And so you're starting to see this EPD process really incorporated into a number of different opportunities for whether it be a developer or an architect or an engineer, when they're looking at making material choices, trying to make sure that they're making the best choice for their particular application and trying to make the best environmental choice based on the materials that they're using. Just as an aside, this bridge that you see in this particular photo is a concrete bridge placed in Yreka, California. Interestingly enough, this is actually the world's first bridge that has cellulosic nanomaterials embedded into it. And so the reason I show you this is not just because we're doing this really exciting work with cellulosic nanomaterials, but to talk about, there are different choices we can make when sourcing materials, and understanding these environmental product declarations and what they really mean in terms of sustainability can help us make better choices in terms of different kinds of applications that we're making with the built environment that we're trying to achieve more sustainability in. So just a quick set of some of the EPDs, the environmental product declarations that are already being produced by our solid lumber folks. Tons of, lots of information goes into these, but we're producing these environmental product declarations, and we're able to actually then use them to tell the environmental story of forest products and the value that they have to the built environment. So where are these EPDs being used? So there are a number of different emerging calculators and tools and opportunities for architects, developers, engineers to try to understand the entire consequences of a building that they are putting up. And so there's a calculator now that is being produced by EC3, the Embedded Carbon in Construction Calculator. Athena Institute is producing one that's an eco-calculator. Of course, you probably heard of the Leadership in Environment and Energy, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, the LEED program that you've seen on a lot of buildings talking about various sustainability initiatives associated with the built environment. There's Green Globes. There are many more of these types of information opportunities out there that help us determine, some of the types of material choices that really lead towards sustainability in the built environment. And what's interesting is not all of these treat forest products the same way, as you probably very well know. And so, for example, in the EC3 calculator, we've got some significant challenges because what they're asking for, and it's sort of interesting, if you're looking for an environmental product declaration, an EPD for concrete, you can go to a ready-mix facility. These are the concrete facilities that you spot all over the country that produce the concrete that goes into those trucks that have the rotating drums on them. They can produce an EPD at most of those facilities for any different type of mix of concrete because they just change a few calculations, they develop an EPD for that, and then they try to give you the environmental footprint of that particular concrete mix that they're giving to you for any particular application. Now, EC3 loves that because they can get very customized looks at what the implications of using a particular type of concrete are in a construction project. Now, they have some real criticism for forest products because the way that we've been developing environmental product declarations is that we do a sort of a regional assessment, and we're able to say for, softwood lumber coming from the Pacific Northwest, this is the environmental footprint. And so some of the architects and the engineers and developers are saying things like, well, can't we get an EPD for a particular type of softwood lumber from a particular mill that we're sourcing from? And of course, the commoditized nature of forest products, isn't necessarily going to really move in that direction. In the basement that I'm sitting in, where we've finished this out in my offices, I have 2x4s from 3 different suppliers. Some came from Canada, some came from Washington State, and some came from Oregon, all here in Bethesda, Maryland. So, the idea that we could actually be able to produce a particular EPD for one 2x4 from one forest products facility isn't necessarily the way we want to go. But some of the architects out there are demanding that kind of information. And so how can we do a better job of this? And right now, the LCA information that we have is not as comprehensive as we would like it to be because, like many of you have been talking about over the last couple of days, reporting isn't always consistent. And so we have significant challenges in terms of getting facilities to report so that we can produce the kind of robust data that we want to be able to produce so we can tell this environmental story a little bit better. Now, we've got good data. I'm confident in a lot of the work that's been done, and you're going to hear from Elaine from O'Neill from Quorum here in just a minute. And she's one of the world leading experts in this area. But, and we're very confident in the data that we're producing, but it could be better. And that's where I think TPO really could fit into a general, different kind of approach that we could actually produce better data for the long term. So, what we want to do in this LCA data right now is if you look at it, what we're doing is we're typically doing a 5-year type of sample where we're going and asking mill managers to provide data for us. And we'd like to move that to an annualized process. It's interesting, the CEOs of most of the major wood producing forest products companies have all committed that they want to be more responsive to these surveys and want to get better data into the system because they recognize the value of having better data, how important it is to the users of their materials, how important it is to the sustainability story. So what we've been talking through is what are the minimum set of questions that we could ask to get those data requirements, because we're asking an awful lot of a mill manager. When we were talking about the surveys from TPO over the last couple of days, I think it was something like 415 items that are being asked on a 4-page questionnaire. I know some of those questionnaires, I think a couple of them were actually longer than 4 pages. So we're asking a lot of information from a mill manager that, that's not their primary responsibility. So one of the things that we're looking at too is how can we make this a little bit easier? And so we're working with the American Wood Council to create an online type of system where we can better collect this data, provide ways that mill managers can access that information system and be able to provide data. And this is a two-way street too. It's not, this is the value of it too, is it's not just that these mill managers are providing this information for the outside world. They can also use the data that's being collected from their competitors in a particular region to improve their own performance as well. So there are opportunities for the mills to benefit from the data long-term going forward. Now, so how do we do this? How do we minimize the impact on managers? And one of the things that I'm really wondering is if there's a way that we could all talk together about maybe having a type of a focus group or a process where we invite mill managers all together and we learn from them what it's like to fill out these surveys, what they'd like to see, what would make their systems easier. For example, if we go to this online type of system, many of these organizations have accounting systems. There aren't that many accounting systems that are out there in terms of software packages. Could we actually devise an online system that integrates those accounting packages right into the online data collection so that we can actually get that information right out of the system, so that's much less burden on the mill manager to access the system and provide the data that we're looking for? The LCA data, the difference between TPO and LCA is that we ask a lot more questions about energy consumption. So things like how much diesel is used in the field to harvest material, how much diesel is used to move that material from the woods to a particular facility, how much energy is consumed in the facility itself, how much of that is bioenergy, how much of that is grid energy, what does that look like overall, et cetera. So there's, that's kind of the difference that we have, but are there ways that we could integrate some of these systems together so that we're getting all the data that we need from more mills and we're getting more robust information on an annualized basis so we can produce much better data overall? And really what I'd ultimately like to see is one survey that actually meets the needs of all of us. So that the TPO data is integrated, has some energy information in it as well, so that we can actually start working through a way that the mill manager gets one survey annually. They know it's coming. They know what kinds of questions they're going to be asked. They're able to pre-populate some of that data with their own facility systems in an online type of system. They're able to integrate that into their accounting systems. So once again, they can reduce the burden on their data collection and they can get the kinds of information out so that we can do the analysis that we need to do to both tell the story of forest products, to tell the story of sustainability, and to really position our products to be the carbon storage solutions that we all know they are. We need to prove to the world through really credible information so that we can show the sustainability long-term and the carbon sequestration potential of these materials based on their energy profile, based on the growth rates that we've got in the woods. That all ties back to that FIA data. This is an incredibly important set of information that we've got. We've got a carbon storage solution that people are looking for right now. And now is the moment that we can seize this and really take this forward and make sure that wood is the premier carbon solution going forward. Because in my mind right now, there's no doubt that forests are the real short-term solution that we have for meeting the climate crisis that we're facing. But it's also a long-term solution as well. And if we continue to position ourselves with credible data, consistent data, that we can prove to companies like Apple, that's $2.25 trillion in market capitalization, that forests are the solution for their needs to meet carbon sequestration and do something about climate change, we've got a real partnership that could really advance the interest of the forest sector, along with a lot of people that are looking for carbon sequestration solutions and ultimately doing something about climate change. So that's it from me. Lots of questions that I have and lots of opportunities, I think, to try to synthesize some of these efforts and find ways that we can work together to reduce the burdens and get better data overall. And I look forward to both your feedback in terms of how we might go about some of these things and other ways that we might find collaborative opportunities so that we're really producing the kinds of solutions that folks are looking for. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I'll turn it back to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Michael. We do have time for some quick questions, and I think there were a couple that popped up in the chat. One from Steve talking about, do you know the proportion of U.S. sawmills, sawmill production is represented by the American Wood Council members? And then some other comments you can look at.
Yeah, so the actual sawmill members that are part of AWC, it's a pretty significant portion, I think, and Elaine's coming up next. She may know this better than I do, but I think it was somewhere around 80 to 85% are members of AWC. So there's really a great opportunity there to work with those members to get the kinds of data that we need. I was incredibly encouraged by the commitments of the CEOs that are members of AWC to really push the data collection efforts and recognize the importance of this going forward. I'm sorry, Danielle, did you have a second question that I may have stumbled over it?
The other ones are more comments, comments about would mill managers actually know those logging logistics related to energy inputs?
They do. As a matter of fact, I mean, it's a big part of the survey that we ask those kinds of data, what's the haul ratio? A lot of that is interpreted by some of the folks that do the LCA analysis. But, it starts with understanding, just basic information like how long, what's the general haul radius, where are they sourcing from at any particular point in time. We certainly have factors for understanding what the harvest energy is required to produce a certain amount of board feet from a particular region. So that data is available and part of the overall solution. So, the mill manager may not have that particular data at their fingertips, but there are ways that we get that out of these systems from some of the LCA experts that are out there in the world right now. And again, Quorum has done some of the best job of this data collection in the world and has some of the best understanding of how to do this right. The other thing that I'll add too is that the whole concept of environmental product declarations actually was created by the forest sector. These EPDs now are coming out in all sorts of different industries around the world, but they started with forestry and forest products. And I think that's a real credit to what we've been trying to do to tell the sustainability story for a very long time. I see a question about how much does the location of harvest influence LCA carbon. It kind of depends on where. Again, when you look at economics of haul ratios, there's a limitation on what makes sense for a particular facility to pull wood into there in terms of making an economic decision. But that location of harvest does influence LCA because, if you've got a mill that's hauling from much further distances than others, obviously, that environmental footprint grows for that particular product. So, somebody that's a sawmill operating on the west side of the Cascades is going to have a different footprint than perhaps a facility on the east side of the Cascades that has access to more timber in a concentrated area. So, when you see some of these regional differences, that is some of what's going on there in terms of the analysis. Not sure I see any other specific questions. Any other questions that anyone has that would like to share without the chat?
No? All right. Well, thank you, Michael, and stick around. And again, we'll have some more time for questions later.
I will. Thank you all very much.
Thanks. And I'm pleased to welcome Elaine O'Neill to the virtual stage. Whenever you're ready, Elaine.
Okay, you should be able to see me, and I'm going to try this share, and let's hope it works. All right. Oh, good. Looks like you can see it. Just hang on, I'm going to move a few things here. All right, well, thank you very much for having me. And I'd have to say that, Michael's kind of a hard act to follow. I'll do my best. And I think he did a really fabulous job of setting the stage and defining some of the terms that I'm going to use in this talk. And I think looking at the chat, there is a lot of energy around this particular topic. what I'm going to do is really talk about, I'm going to get down in the weeds again. I'm going to talk about the granularity requirements for a life cycle assessment, specifically around allocation. And are the slides disappearing for everybody? Nadia said the slides disappeared for her.
No, we can see them.
Okay.
Sometimes it's an individual bandwidth thing. So sorry about that, Nadia.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. So within the life cycle assessment, it's really, there's a lot of granularity that's required. And so looking at that and how we might be able to use TPO data as a cross-reference, a cross-validation is really what I wanted to talk about today. So I am the Director of Science and Sustainability with Quorum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what Quorum is, because some folks know us and some don't. Essentially, it's Quorum is a nonprofit research organization. Right now we have about 20 members, and you can mostly universities that have wood products research as a component of their program. And the thing about that is that each one of these institutions is going to have a different skill set. And that was the primary reason Quorum was established back in 1996 by Bruce Lipke, was really to tap into the expertise across the US, and we actually have some entities in Canada as well, to look at understanding the environmental performance of wood and wood products. What have we done since 96, which is, we're coming up on our 25th anniversary here pretty soon. We've produced a lot of detailed analysis on wood products, on their environmental performance, such that we're really classifying ourselves as the go-to place for wood LCA. We've actually published 4 peer-reviewed issues of journals, not just articles, but actual issues, 2 in Wood and Fiber Science and 2 in the Forest Products Journal. And those look at an array of products, an array of regions. We've also done a lot of the industry-wide product LCA reports, and we've done them to the level that we could produce environmental product declarations, as Michael described. In addition to this, we actually have dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed publications, and we've talked virtually all over the world about the results that we're seeing from our work. We've made everything pretty much publicly available on the quorum.org website. And I think that the point that's useful for people to understand is we have always worked closely with industry in order to get the necessary data to be precise with this. But by and large, our funding is almost all federal government. We work very closely with the Forest Products Lab. We've done a lot of work with the Department of Energy. So U.S. Forest Service and federal funding, some state funding to do this work. So it's a pretty robust effort over the past 24 years. So without getting too far down in the weeds at the moment, what is LCA? It's really an input-output analysis. It's a scientific method that's designed to answer these questions on environmental impact, but more than that, about environmental improvement. How can you do a better job of doing the things that you do now if you're a mill manager? How do you drive down your energy use, because that drives down cost? How do you improve your yield, because that improves profit? And the processes really are separated into 2 categories. There is the milling side of the equation. So that's the mill surveys. That's where, TPO, that relationship that Michael just talked about, that's really, really important. But before that, there's what we call the forest resource side of things. Typically, you have a different level or a different kind of expertise. So that's sort of a natural segregation there. And in that forest resource component of the LCA, you're looking at everything from growing the seedling in places where they do planting, all the way through any kind of management that occurs, harvesting and loading it on the truck. And there was a question there about does the mill manager know about hauling? They do. The surveys, we use the mill surveys actually to answer the haul distance question, because it varies mill by mill. So that information is there, but the upstream processes before that are not necessarily there. Obviously, there's a lot of data. This is a very, very data intensive process. We rely exclusively on the mill surveys. Well, that's not actually true. We rely on the mill surveys to understand the energy, but then you'll use LCA software upstream inputs. Like if you have X amount of electricity, for example, you have to know what proportion of that electricity comes from fossil fuels, non-fossil fuels. So we use EcoInvent data and US LCI data to do that upstream input. Likewise, the upstream inputs from everything occurring in the forest resources are coming out of these national and international data sets that we then apply to our models. Since the beginning, we have looked at this and said, what sort of processes and procedures should we follow? And we have always opted to use ISO standards. The dominant ones are there, 14,040, 14,044, and recently 21,930. What these standards do is they set out clear guidelines for doing a life cycle inventory, LCI, a life cycle impact assessment, LCIA, and which feed into that life cycle report. Now, all of these cross linkages here are to get you to understand that these standards drive what goes into an LCA, but they also drive what goes into what we call a product category rule, which is developed collaboratively with industry and interested participants to identify what needs to go into an environmental product declaration, and because the environmental product declaration comes from the LCA, what needs to go into the LCA. So there's this whole network of things that we have to look at in order to produce something that will meet the requirements of the end user, in this case, the environmental, the people that want the environmental product declaration, but also something that's robust and transparent and follows the concept, the international standards that we're following. A little bit about how we do that. This is essentially an input-output modeling process. We're modeling what goes in, the raw materials and the energy. That little gray box, I don't know if you'll be able to, I don't know if you can see that cursor or not. That little gray box is what we call our system boundary. And our outputs are emissions, both to the atmosphere, the water, solid waste, co-products, other releases, and obviously the product we're producing, whether it's a 2x4 or a piece of plywood or oriented strand board, etc. That is our boundary. And then for the each individual step, each individual life cycle, Quorum is basically focused on those first 3 years: forest growth and management, harvesting, transportation, wood manufacturing. We've done some work on modeling use of material and very little actually on waste management. But other folks are picking that up in the academic space. I think the thing to emphasize is this model and this method is attributional. In other words, you're measuring inputs and outputs. You're not looking at the consequences of, if we did something different, what would it be? How would that affect it? So you're really looking at, how does this system operate in terms of an energy and materials flow? What is the mass balance and what is the energy balance? I want to zoom in a little bit to that forest resources component, because that's where I do most of my work. And just to get people to understand that we're looking at all of those steps within the forest resource system. We're looking at any kind of silvicultural operations that occur, what they are, what are the inputs to them. I mean, if you're applying herbicide and fertilizer and doing a pretty aggressive additional mechanical site prep, you're going to have different kinds of energy inputs than if you allow for natural regeneration. You're also going to have different growth. Growth and yield is really critical. And then the harvesting systems matter. And so we look at all of those things And we recognize that in each one of these cases we're going to come up with different outcomes. And I think it's important for us to recognize that our management systems vary substantially between owner groups, between places in the country. Our rotation ages vary a lot, our yield varies a lot, and our recovery varies a lot. And all of those things have an impact on what that upstream footprint is, what that forest resource footprint is. The other thing that we're grappling with at the moment is this idea of, I'm going to call it, it's an allocation issue between the different producers. This chart is from, it's adapted from Fox et al. 2004, and it sounds like there were improvements since 2010 or even more remarkable than this. This is specific to the Southeast. Through all of the work that they've done to improve the growth in yield of southern pine, they're getting nearly a 13-fold increase in yield while cutting their growth period from 50 years to about 18. That's remarkable increase in productivity, but not everybody's doing it. And so how do you identify and do an allocation that accurately reflects what those products, accurately reflects the footprint of the products that are being produced? So you look at, we do the survey kind of work, we do the peer-reviewed research kind of work. So those are two data sets. We look at other sources of data to try to zero in and answer these questions as best we can in terms of allocation. And ideally, we would be able to use FIA and TPO data for that effect, because as one of the commenters said, it's difficult in many instances to get data out of proprietary data out of companies that, this is their business. And that's fair enough. But we don't necessarily need all of that proprietary data in order to do a fairly good job of, I'm going to call it triangulation into an answer that's relatively reflective of that footprint. I want to talk a little bit about harvest systems. Oftentimes when I'm in a meeting with an architect or an engineer, they really hate clear cutting. They would much prefer that we do some harvesting with a team in the old-fashioned way. It certainly has far fewer emissions and potentially less environmental impacts, but in terms of efficiency and being able to meet the needs of a modern developed country, there's consequences. And what we try to do is grapple with that and grapple with the uncertainties around each one of these inputs. So all that work, the take-home message is that we have produced the carbon footprint per cubic meter of wood over the past 24 years, both for the forest resources component of it. And here's just an example for the Pacific Northwest, where we've been able to say, here's how much energy it takes, here's your emissions, here's your carbon footprint to produce this. And by the way, this is how much carbon you're storing in that wood. Here's your net sequestration. It's always a negative number, which means that you're storing more carbon than you're emitting. That leads to the wood is good story. People say, oh, good, wood is good. That's the whole story. That's the reason the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world are jumping all over wood. But their question of, but is it sustainable? Can you keep doing this forever? Means that we have to think of new ways and new methods of data to get to the information that we want. So I'm going to go back to this chart, and we're going to zero in on ISO 21930 for a minute. ISO 21930 talks about the need to look at the sustainability of the wood resource. And the way that they do that is they say on a national level, you can count this carbon stored in this wood product if the place that it's coming from is the carbon stocks on the forest line are stable or increasing. Then you can say, yes, all of this wood product in this 2x4 or whatever it is that you're dealing with, you can count that whole component. Otherwise, you're going to have to net out some if it's decreasing. So this is a place where we can go to the FIA data and start to look at it and say, overall in the US, we can check that box and say, yes, our carbon on the land is stable and increasing. We can say that regionally there are a little bit of, there's a few challenges. If we even look at over the time period that's currently published in the from Oswald 2019, you can see those change ratios. I thought the really interesting thing about that, because I'm a data nerd, is what the change ratios look like in terms of growing stock cubic feet per acre in these different regions, and how that's even increasing everywhere except on the Pacific coast, which we may deal with in a minute. I dig a little deeper in this data and I get all excited about, okay, now I can start to think about using this data as a cross-reference for those allocations between, private corporate acres, private non-corporate acres. Can I do some allocation there that says, 60% of my volume is coming from private corporate and they represent this many acres. Here's a data point. But then I go to the TPO and what I get is something very different. Everything is lumped together. All that other public is lumped together. TPO at least separates the forest industry and private, but they do it in a way that's a little bit interesting. In the West, apparently, they ask that question during the surveys. In the East, they don't, so they have to go back and do some conversions and some calculations based on some other data to come up with some estimates of how much is forest industry and how much is private. And then when we start talking about removals so that we can tie this production back to the landscape, we lose the granularity altogether. Everything is lumped into private. So this becomes less useful for my purposes. I know that there are significant limits on how data gets recorded inside of FIA, but if there were ways to allow some additional granularity there, this would be a lot more useful for us as another data point in our triangulation. So why does it matter? I use this data sometimes when I'm talking to architects and engineers, and it scares them. So this again comes out of Oswald et al. I just looked at their numbers, and we have in the Pacific Northwest, for example, just about 8% of all forest land in the U.S. is in there, forest timberland, timberland in the U.S. And of that, about 3.5% is private. But that 8% of U.S. timberland produces 34% of U.S. plywood and lumber. And 80% of that is coming from 3.5% of the U.S. acres. So people can, they can be concerned that maybe we're harvesting too much in the Pacific Northwest to meet this wood demand. They're concerned about sustainability. We can look at it a different way, and I do try to present this kind of data that talks a lot about how these major wood baskets, we're actually seeing an increase in volume and in acres like we do in the Southeast. I think I put those on there, yeah. The Southeast and the Pacific Northwest and the South Central, we're seeing these increases in the major wood producing baskets, and we're seeing some places where it's tanking, which aren't necessarily wood producing buckets, wood baskets. So those pieces I think we can use. Eventually we're going to have to deal with mortality as a factor in our forest carbon accounting, I believe. Right now we're under the banner of 21930 that looks at things nationally. But when you're in a nation as big as the U.S. as compared to say something like Germany or Finland, which is a very, small country with a very discrete wood baskets, I think the pressure will force us to go towards regional analysis. And then we're going to have to unpack, are these things actually lumber producing regions, or are they not? And I think this is probably something Canada is grappling with, because they've had such a massive bark beetle outbreak in British Columbia, which is a major wood producing region. And now they're no longer carbon neutral because I lost so much of it to mortality. So I want to just, I think I already talked about this actually, this idea that, is there a way for when TPO collects that data, maybe through this process that Michael is advocating with the American Wood Council, to be able to get more granularity and a greater, a tighter fit between what's happening on the forest resource side and what's happening in the mill product side. I think in the future, it's going to be an ongoing and continuing demand on the part of the users of this data, whether it's the architects, the engineers, or now the companies that have jumped on board saying, we want to be sustainable, but we want to use wood, and we want to use it from places that are sustainably managed. So that's what I had for you today. I have a few questions, time for questions, although I think I went over. So.
Thanks, Elaine. No, that was great. Again, we'll have time at the end at 3:40 for questions, depending on how long Bob goes. So Bob Apt is our next presenter, but feel free to keep the chat going. All right, whenever you're ready, Bob.
Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. I'm Bob Apt. I'm the former co-director of SOFAC. The new director is Justin Baker, and Jesse Henderson, who's now with the Forest Service, also worked on some of this stuff. So first I'll describe what SOFAC does, how we use FIA plot data and TPO data, and sort of like Elaine's talk, there's some of my, I guess, ideas for improvements would be linking those things in a more compatible way. So let me see if I can get this to go down. So I'm not getting slide advancing here.
Hover toward the left.
Okay. So it's advancing. Okay, resume slideshow. Okay, here we go. So SOFAC is a group of really all parts of the interest groups involved in the Southern Forest Resource. It's the major owners of land, the major consumers of wood projects, the major TMOs and REITs are part of it. This membership list might be a little bit out of date. But what we're charged to do and what they fund is for us to take the latest FIA data and the latest TPO data and try to put it in a package that's useful for them in terms of strategic planning. So some of that's a pure resource piece and some of it's a pure modeling piece. And I think for a fair number of these companies, we may be one of the main filters between the FIA and TPO data and their use of it. So I have MOUs and lots of conversations with the principals in the Forest Service who make our work possible. And we fill a lot of requests from the user end. So I'll go through a typical example. It might be someone who's going to build a mill, or it might be someone who has a mill wanting to look at the future. And they will send us, maybe a 60-mile circle of area they're interested in, or more often they'll send us 7 or 8 different areas they're interested in that they want to compare. So we update our plot data every time more than a couple of states show up. Matter of fact, Ray Sheffield just sent me an email saying that there's new data available, and we'll download the next batch. And we take that data and process it, and including in that processing is doing some region-wide growth estimates and those kinds of things. But when someone sends us a data request, they tend to send us either a lat long or they send us a list of counties. And what we send back when we have the databases set up to this, what we send out almost instantaneously is we send out the latest FIA plot data for that region. We also have the history of FIA data for those counties. And so we send back the current data, the history of inventory and acreage by management type and product class. We send the whole TPO mill consumption data history to them. And then we send these things called TPO adjustment factors, which I'll describe, which is really one of the ways we've become dependent on TPO is, how removal data in the plots is an annual average between remeasurement dates. What we need is a fixed year removal. And so we use TPO as ancillary data to try and come up with a way to do that. So this just, the kind of plot data we send to folks. We have the growth per acre, we have a regression on the growth per acre, we have removals from land use change, we have other removals, which would be things put into reserves, and we have it by owner, and we have corporate and non-corporate split out with a MOU. We can't release that at the county level, but in the aggregates that we're sending to people, we can split that out. And we have all this set up sort of on a ready to go basis when we get a request. What we do with TPO is two main things: looking at consumption trends by product and regional variation in that. And then we also look at, we update the annual average removals to a fixed year, as I described. So these are just a couple examples. If I was doing this for one of the SOFAC members, these would likely be basins, not states that would be looking at, but we'd look at the PST recovery and how it's going and how it varies across regions. You can see a pretty big difference here up to the 2017 data between the left-hand side and Louisiana and Florida on the right-hand side. Louisiana and Florida also are currently dealing with hurricane damage, so that's something else that we work with a lot. We're working with Hurricane Michael stuff right now. Here's an interesting question: is who's using hardwood pulp these days? Well, it's not a big factor in the fluff pulp and packaging market, so that pulpwood use has gone down consistently for the whole data set. By the way, if I showed the pine would be at all-time highs. And on the right-hand side is what used to be in the other industrial category. And my proxy for pellets up until it was recently recharacterized was the increase in the other category that started abruptly in 2009 is usually pellets. So you can see about 2009, a lot of the use, the upward trend in hardwood pulpwood use is on the pellet side, not on the paper side, but remember the scale is different, right? The 50,000 cubic feet is the total for the pellet side, but it's down at the 10th of the paper side. So even though it's where the dynamic upshift is, and certainly regionally, pellets are a bigger player, can be a bigger player than the paper industry. So if you're not familiar with the plot data, when we pull plot data, this is the way we summarize the data. And so for example, this chart shows that with the pull, this was actually last year's data pull, we had a compilation year of 2017 for Mississippi. The plots were on average measured toward the end of 2015, but the previous measurement goes back all the way to 2008, and the average date for remeasurement, in other words, between the current one and the previous one, is 2011. So what you get for removals is actually an annual average between remeasurement dates. And that is useful, except I can't stop, my model doesn't project annual averages, it just projects annual. So, when I pull, if I was going to make a run for Mississippi from the data, I would be pulling the 2017 data, but I'd probably start the model at 2015 because that's the average date that those plots were visited, even in the 2017 compilation year. But the bigger question is, if I'm going to say the start year is 2015, what are 2015 removals? If removals stayed flat for decades at a time, it wouldn't matter so much. But as you know, from 2009 on, we've had a major recession. We have a major recovery on the housing side. We have hurricanes. So what I need is some way to move the plot removal information up to a start year. And this year, in this case, that year would be 2015. And so here's the concept behind it is, if you look at the TPO data, this would be Mississippi pine large roundwood consumption. And as other folks have mentioned, right, if I'm trying to link these things together, I can link veneer and saw timber into a large category, and I can link pulpwood and other industrial into a small roundwood category, because the TPO definitions don't necessarily line up with the way the mills look at the data. So I tend to group it that way. But in this case, in this hypothetical example, the Mississippi roundwood consumption data may show the trend that we see on the blue line. The plot data may be spread over the 2000 to 2015 period. And what I'm trying to do is, okay, I'm going to look at what the TPO removal trend over the period where we were sampling the data on plots, and then compare the last year, compare 2015 to the average, right? And so in this case, 2015 consumption is 9% lower than the 2005 to 2015 average. So we're trying to use TPO as, we can measure removals over the whole period of the remeasurement period, but what we need to do is calibrate that up to a standard year. So that's the idea that we're trying to implement. And that sounds pretty easy, and it actually isn't all that hard, but you've got to remember that the way the moving sample works, the years aren't equally weighted in any one sample. So in this case, right, this removal period goes from 2005 to 2015, but 2010 is represented 5 times, maybe 6 times in that sample. And 2005 has just got 1 sample left, and 2015 is the latest data, so it's only got 1 sample in it. And so we actually have to weight the TPO data in a way that's parallel to the plot design so that we make these data comparable. When we do that, we get interesting things. This is just mapping the 2017 TPO adjustment factors for large roundwood, and what the colors mean. If it's green to dark green, it went up more than 2017 was, this is a switch from 2015 to 2017 data, but the 2017 data was 25% higher than the trend. So if you look across the South, there was some recovery by 2015. There was a bump up from 2013 to 2015, but there was a big jump from 2015 to 2017. So the dark green had more than a 25% jump. The light green had were about average, and the yellow actually went down in 2017. And this is using the weighted average. So you can see there's a lot of spatial variation, which makes sense because mills are, in a dynamic time when you're going through a recession or pellets are coming on, there's a lot of opening and closings and restructuring. So if you're going to try to come up with a small basin level analysis, you've got to have data local to the place you're looking at. This is the 2017 data. The top graph is hardwoods, and this is by Timber Mart South price region. So these are sort of half state regions. And I guess the thing to note is you can see on the bottom graph, which is softwood, and the large roundwood is orange and the blue is the small roundwood, all really big upward trend and softwoods almost universally, in both pulp and saw timber. And like I said, pine pulpwood is at an all-time consumption high, right? Because with absorbance and packaging especially, and especially given these days, packaging is really taking off. And if you add pellets, which is not all that big relative to pulpwood, but if you add that demand on top of an all-time high on the pulpwood demand, you get some interesting numbers. Hardwoods, the percents are huge, but that's because the baseline is small. So, you know, a hardwood mill opening or closing can make a big difference in regions where there's not much hardwood capacity. And we sort of have to screen out some of these fluctuations in the model because we don't want one mill to be driving the results. The average is the simple average I'm showing there, which shows softwood up, small roundwood hardwood up, probably do more to pellets than anything else, and large roundwood hardwood down. Of course, when we're running the Southwide model, we're not using the simple average. When we run the model, each survey unit or each basin that we have in it gets its own TPO adjustment based on the counties in that one. And then what happens in the South as a whole is a weighted average adjustment to the whole market based on those TPO numbers for each individual region. So, first of all, if you work with the folks that provide this data, and I'd say I spend about half my conversations with the state folks that are working to provide that data, and the U.S. Forest Service folks who are compiling and trying to do quality control in that data. The first thing I want to say is thank you for all the work to do this. It's a Herculean effort. It takes you know, keeping states consistent and keeping the data up to speed is a huge task. So here's some things I'm interested in. Some of them I think I might know the answer to, but while we're on this session about what would be nice moving forward, carbon is an obvious one. We do have carbon equations tied to our volume equation, so we actually can do carbon associated with inventory change in our runs, but we need to update that methodology to sort of keep up with the science and the Forest Service in terms of carbon. There are some things that we have to play with, and this ties back to what Elaine was saying, actually, is, you know, chip and saw is a pretty important category in the South, right? That's small saw timber. And it can, you know, it can go to pulp mills when saw timber prices are low. So we've gone through a phase where probably at least half or maybe more of the small saw timber went to pulp mills. And we can come into boom times when it's all going to saw timber. There's not a way in the TPO data to really distinguish that. I end up in the models trying to do some weighted average between what's happening on the pulpwood side and what's happening on the saw timber side to guess what's happening on the chip and saw side. And you can dig into the TPO data and see some diameter distribution of what wood is going to which mills. But it's a very important category. You know, people I work with will have a heated conversation about whether it should be 9 to 11 or 9 to 12. You know, and for someone who's looking at the data, that the data is really not good enough to do much about with that level of difference. But it is an important category, and it's sort of an in-between category. So, you know, if I was thinking about a wish list, right, from the FI data, I have no idea where the wood goes. In other words, chip and saw from the FI data, the way I use it would be a certain diameter class. But I don't have any idea whether that diameter class is going to a chip and saw mill or a paper mill. So reconciling that in a way that's consistent, I think, is possible. It's something we haven't taken advantage of, but I think it's going to become more important. So this isn't really a Forest Service problem, but it's a user TPO user problem. Is all the, you know, Texas has its own methodology. They do their own surveys within the state. You can, and they are cooperative. They have strict rules about how you can get access to it. What I've been able to get from them is certainly not county level data, but I can get survey unit level data, and so I end up having to use, you know, when a county falls into one of those survey units, I use that data. But what's really hard is, for example, I just ran through those Timber Mart South TPO numbers, and while I've gotten the data from Texas, usually on PDFs, I haven't, and it's at the survey unit level, I haven't incorporated it into it. So Texas, for a while, whenever I update my TPO data, Texas is just absent. And Texas is a place where there's a lot of interest. So it'd be nice, and I don't think this is really a Forest Service responsibility, but it would be nice for there to be an agreement between Texas and the Forest Service not to take over their system, but to have some averages from what they do that could be built into the database so that we can get a complete database from one place. It would also be nice to have, I've seen behind the screen on this, but to get the data out the following year. So I'm hoping that the move to a sample survey rather than a pseudo census will help us move in that direction. Again, if things were steady, it really wouldn't matter that much, but things are happening pretty fast these days, right? Lumber prices are all-time highs. Salt timber prices in the South are still low. They're starting to come up. And so, the 2019 data, even though it will, right? Let me just point this out. When I'm using inventory data, I do not have 2019 data. I'll still be using data called 2017 or 2015 even. So it's not so much a modeling question, but it is sort of a what's happening in these areas and how does it vary by region. That would be nice to have. And I guess I'm just hopeful that the sampling methodology might move us in that direction. And pellets were up until, I guess, 2017, right? Pellets by pseudo pellet category was the other industrial, which also includes post and poles, for example. But I treated the surge that started in 2009 in an area as the pellet signal. And I think that's wrong, but it's not as wrong as not having the data. So now there is a pellet category, but I haven't really explored this. There's probably an easy answer to this question, but I haven't really explored whether we can have compatible data sets that go back or whether there's a break in the data series. And so what else? So the thing that, I'm in conversation with the Forest Service in Colston, and there's a lot of push towards small area estimation, and SOFAC will be an active partner and consumer of that information. And I really like the idea of like what I'm doing, which is using TPO data as ancillary data to improve my removals estimates in the region. But I'm just curious, if we're pooling data sets that have different, and especially with the sampling idea, we have variances on those data. Is there a way that that arrow can go both ways so that the TPO data can be improved by better small area estimation estimates? It's just a question. It may have a simple answer, which is it doesn't make sense, but it's something that has occurred to me. And then I also think about the new sampling strategy in terms of downscaling the counties. So, like with, I know there are some examples where you can't avoid missing a new mill opening or maybe even a mill closing. But, if you miss a pellet mill that comes online, that's a big player in a small region, and it stays in the historical data, and you sort of have this asterisk by that year for a long time. So, and I'm thinking about it in a sampling strategy, how do you not avoid new mills coming online, I guess? And I guess it may be just the same discovery package and it goes into the sample ahead of time. And if it doesn't go into the sample, it's not available. So maybe it's not different, but I'm curious about that since I never thought we were really doing a census, but a pseudo census was saying that it had everything. And I think recognizing that we don't do that is a step forward. But what does it mean when we downscale? If the paper mill in this region wasn't sampled that year, what does it mean for those counties? So that's me. I'm done.
Thanks, Bob. We appreciate it. And again, we're going to hold questions until the end of the session. But right now, we actually have a scheduled break, so folks can feel free to stretch. Perfect. All right. Well, it looks like it's 2:40 on my clock exactly. So we will get started back from our break. And the first presenter is Steve Presley. So I'm going to let Steve take it away.
Okay, thank you. And leave it to me to trip over the mic cord as I ascend to the virtual stage, but hopefully it'll go okay. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about TPO data in the commercial forestry sector. And for those of you who don't know, in CASSI, that's the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, and we're a nonprofit research institute serving the commercial forestry sector with member companies both as landowners and manufacturing facilities. And so I'd like to address their needs for TPO data. And in the most general sense, we all know this, that on one side we have market activity in forest products markets, and on the other side we have forest outcomes. So for example, if we have an increase in the quantity of softwood pulpwood demanded, we might see outcomes like changes in the pine forest class, forest age type, age class distributions. But in between those, there's a lot of complexity involving multiple levels of manufacturers, different organizations, different products. And TPO helps us interpret the interplay, for example, between what plots measure, FIA plots measure on the forest side and market activity that we see on the market side. So it's a critical linkage between these. And it's nice to be able to go after Bob Apt to talk to you about the SOFAC and wood supply modeling aspect need for TPO, because that's a lot of what our members need as well for strategic planning. And this applies both to manufacturers and landowners. They need to track and anticipate wood markets, including volumes and prices. And the spatial distribution of those resources or the supply and the distribution of consumption or demand is critical as well, because the key role that transportation costs play in these markets. So strategic planning is a specific need. Sustainability is another. All of these companies are under tremendous pressure to document that their activities are sustainable. They're all usually certified under one or more sustainable forestry certification schemes like SFI or FSC. And that takes a lot of data to document that what they're doing is sustainable. And in addition, TPO can offer information for context and perspective about sustainability. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's an excellent example that came out recently from Consuelo Brandeis and Karen Apt in 2019 in Journal of Forestry, who published this data, TPO volume by primary product. And for those of you who don't know, in Europe, there's a lot of people who are very concerned that their use of biomass energy is devastating southern forests. And if you lean real close to your monitor, you can see a little green bar here that is the pellets, the wood pellets. So you can really see the role that wood pellets play in the overall southern forest market, and it's just dwarfed by saw logs. And you saw that in Bob's slides too, where he had to have a totally different scale to show the wood pellet changes. So this is much needed perspective on something like sustainability, like if wood pellet markets double, no, the southern forest will not be devastated. So sustainability, and then finally I'd add carbon, and this was on Bob's list as well. There's tremendous and growing interest in documenting the carbon footprint of the commercial forestry sector. That includes knowledge about harvested wood product pools. It includes knowledge about utilization, what happens to logging and manufacturing residues, and what's the volume of them. And then carbon implications of market disruptions, which could be COVID, it could be hurricanes, or it could be introduction of pellets or such. So these are kind of the classes of needs for TPO data. Now, in terms of emerging needs, this is not exactly emerging, but I'd like to get into talking about uncertainty. So to do this, I want to take you back for a minute to a 2013 FIA user group meeting in New Orleans, Louisiana. It included a trip to a Enviva pellet mill in Wiggins, Mississippi. And on the wall in that mill was this poster, "That which we measure, we will improve." And it was posted on a wall over their safety performance charts. So clearly they were talking about safety, measuring safety performance so that they could improve safety performance. It immediately, to me, applied to a lot of other things, such as uncertainty. It is really hard to improve the certainty, the precision, the confidence in our estimates if we can't measure them. As a case story, I want to tell you a case example. I'll tell you a story. Maybe I'm channeling Brad Smith, who seemed to have a story for everything. But in the 1990s, I was Forest Resource Information Manager for a paper company that had a number of paper mills as well as 1.5 million acres across the Southeast US. And I worked in a little staff group called the Forest Technology Department, reporting to the technical manager who reported to the Timberlands Division Vice President. And we had 3 operating regions in Timberlands Division, and each of the regional managers reported to that Vice President as well. And our staff group was tasked with developing standards and data analysis procedures for inventory data, and then for summarizing and reporting that data up to division management. So for example, in the standards, some of our standards included the timing of inventory measurements, and we did this by management program. So for example, our pine plantation program, we'd get an initial stocking measurement at age 1. We'd measure a stand at crown closure to get a diameter distribution, and then we'd measure pre-harvest. And other management programs would have different schedules. So while we established the standards in our department, could we ensure that they were met? The answer is no, we couldn't, because while we had responsibility for the inventory, we didn't have the authority to allocate resources, either money or people, to accomplishing the task. So consequently, we had some issues with forest inventory data growing increasingly out of date. And we're in this difficult situation that many people are in, and I'm sure there's some in this group here today, where you have responsibility for accomplishing things while you have no real control over the resources that you depend upon to accomplish it. So my boss and I hatched a plan that involved quantifying uncertainty and communicating it. So we developed a series of graphs to depict what proportion of the volume in our inventory came from out-of-date inventory measurements. And we did this by management program and by region. And it became readily apparent where we had issues. So my boss, Brian, took all these charts and made a presentation at a manager's meeting. And the graphs quickly acquired a new name there. They became known as the Visine graphs, because as you know, Visine gets the red out. And division management made it clear that we would get the red out. And the week after this meeting, I started getting phone calls from the regional inventory leads saying, hey, we need to talk about accelerating our re-inventory schedule. So documenting the source of our uncertainty in a neutral and objective way, we were able to start focusing attention on resolving the issue. And yes, we caused some discomfort, but we did get results. So I tell you that story to kind of introduce the concept maybe of Visine maps. We've heard a lot about non-response as an issue in TPO. And Consuelo helped me assemble data to develop these maps that are showing estimated non-response volume in 1,000 cubic feet. So this is the difference between the TPO reported roundwood production in a survey unit and how much of that production came from response. So the difference is non-response. So these red areas, we had over 100 million cubic feet of non-response. We could also portray this as percent non-response, because we'll have some region where you might have a high percent like Central Florida, but it's a very low production quantity, so maybe that doesn't matter a lot. I'll note that this is 2017 data, so this was prior to the sampling effort, and that these numbers don't necessarily translate immediately to statistically measurable uncertainty in our final estimates, but neither did that out-of-date inventory data. It doesn't always necessarily have to fit a confidence interval to be able to be communicated. We can clearly see if and where we have issues with this. We can do these graphs for all the products. So for example, this is pulpwood non-response. And we clearly see, yes, there's a problem in coastal Georgia and northern Florida, and there's some issues in Mississippi, Alabama as well. So yes, we can measure this kind of uncertainty, and we can communicate it. And as I mentioned yesterday, we've been working on a number of fronts to try and raise the awareness of TPO in response to it. So can we improve it? That's the open question, and I have some questions about this that have already been posed, so I can step through these fairly quickly. One is the trade-off between level of detail that we ask for and response, and whether a simpler survey could garner some more response. So these are pages from a TPO survey form, and they ask in general, who are you? What is the mill? What number of employees, location, that sort of thing. How much roundwood did you use? Where did it come from? Then questions about what did you make with it and what did you do with your leftovers? So fairly simple categories, but I'd like to zoom in on this page 2, which has the really tricky questions on where does it come from. And in the South, this is a grid, by the way, of species as rows and counties by columns. And in the South, especially in states like Virginia and Georgia, where we have really small counties, a 50-mile radius could have 50 counties. So this is a grid of 50 columns, up to 50 columns in all those rows, just for a mill with a 50-mile procurement radius. So the question rises, can we model this? We're sitting on mountains of TPO data that have probably never been thoroughly analyzed. Can we come up with ways to estimate which county something would come from for a mill of a given production level and given type? Are year-to-year changes meaningful? I would suggest that changes in the counties that wood comes from is a totally random event governed by transportation distance, year-to-year random. And would simpler questions provide acceptable data, such as just asking which counties did you procure from? Or as Elaine talked about, something like what is your average or maximum haul distance? And some of the other things, the other forms like what products are made and what happened to residues, I would suspect that there's not a huge amount of variation year to year. I don't know. But I suspect that a mill wouldn't switch from producing furniture stock one year to mine timbers the next. I wouldn't expect that a mill would dispose of residues as fuel in one year and then mulch the next. So is there a way to leverage that simplicity as well to improve response? So that's an open question, and it's been addressed by a number of folks. And then finally, I just want to say a couple of words about carbon. There is an increasing importance of carbon in the commercial sector and knowing and communicating carbon dynamics. And as you've heard from a number of people already, long-term carbon storage in products and landfills is really crucial for accurate carbon accounting. Nadia Tace went into great depth in this, and you understand how critical that data is. This graph on the right is basically using the factors out of Smith et al. 2006 to track storage and harvested wood products. The blue bars are saw timber and the yellow bars are pulpwood products, and that black bar is the average storage over 100 years. So a change in your product mix is going to change this long-term storage possibly dramatically. And then utilization of roundwood and residues is a key factor, because that's usually assumed to be emitted instantly, and to what extent are those residues used for energy, and to what are the quantities that are left in the woods, basically quantities that do not go into long-term storage. And all of this, as you also heard from Nadia, some of this goes back to factors that were developed by people like Clark Rao and Ken Skog back in the 90s or maybe even earlier. And maybe it's time for change. Maybe some of these factors need to be updated. Could TPO, through some of its questions, let us know when some of these factors might change so that we can change the way we do our harvested wood products accounting? So, quick summary. Remember that we can only improve what we measure in general. And can we effectively measure and communicate uncertainty? I will say that going to a sampling approach, one of the big benefits I see in that is the ability to quantitatively address uncertainty. Any efforts that we can use to try and quantify the impact of non-response on uncertainty. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to share those results, that they do cause discomfort, but sometimes you got to get out of your comfort zone. And sometimes that discomfort is what it takes to lead to improvement. So I'd like to see us effectively measure and communicate uncertainty. Can we trade detail for response? We've been talking about that. When can we use modeling? For example, modeling sourcing of wood based on procurement radius given a mill's production and type. And finally, are we confident that these decades-old factors and knowledge in these models for carbon storage and harvested wood products and quantities of logging and mill residues, are we confident that those are still applicable and still appropriate? So with that, hopefully I was quick enough to have a few minutes to address any questions, or I guess we're right about at time.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I don't see any quick questions, although you did get a lot of kudos for your non-response map. Everyone loves that.
Okay, I've got to get back to my, where I can stop sharing. Okay, here we go.
All right. And Ben, if you want to start getting your stuff ready to go. But if anyone has a quick question for Steve, feel free to chime in.
Okay, start my video. Okay, hi. Got
No
it
quick
up
questions for you, Steve. You did such a good job.
Oh, okay.
Keep the chat going, and we'll let Ben get started here on his presentation.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. Hi, my name is Ben Lausberger. I'm the Wood Utilization Specialist for the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in Pennsylvania in the Bureau of Forestry. Again, as the Utilization Specialist in Pennsylvania, I coordinate and conduct the Timber Product Output Survey in the state. I just want to kind of say thanks. This is kind of nice to talk to people that understand what TPO stands for. In the past, some presentations you give, people kind of look at you funny when you say TPO. They don't really know what you're talking about. So it's good to be talking to a group that understands and gets use out of this. So today I want to talk to you about the different users in Pennsylvania and how they use the TPO survey. Most of us know how the community economic development departments in our states use the information, and they use it by encouraging companies to come and take root into the state. But what about the other users? Well, we in Pennsylvania have the nice to be able to have different groups, councils, and associations that use that and share the information with different people. So that's how we'll go over today and talk about that. And another thing is that the survey really can talk about what we want to talk about, the uses, what questions are good to continue asking, and maybe even talk about some questions that we don't think are very useful. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding by the end of this presentation of who in Pennsylvania uses the TPO and how we share that information. So first group or association I'd like to talk to you about is the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. This association has a very large landowner outreach, and they share the groups made up of different environmental groups, businesses, foresters, and a lot of our service foresters. We have 67 counties in Pennsylvania, and each county is represented by a service forester. And this association reaches out to those through large landowner conferences and the service foresters are out there talking to these landowners as well and telling them of the different businesses or sawmills in the area that can help them manage their forest. And the thing about the service foresters is that they are also the people that are helping me conduct the survey. They're actually going out to the mills and handing in the survey and doing the face-to-face with those mills. So it's very important that the TPO is used for these landowners so they can know what mills are out there to harvest their products. The next association I'd like to talk to you about this is the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association. This association was founded in 1980 as the Hardwood Lumber Manufacturers Association. And then in 2003, they changed their name to the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association. And this allowed them to bring into the group secondary manufacturers, and even today we have some equipment manufacturers and suppliers that are part of this group. And this association is used to have a unified voice on legislation and regulatory issues that are happening in the state, so they can go and lobby the legislators and talk to the local officials when they're making decisions that are going to affect the industry. And they use the TPO to really support their data, use that data to support their claims, and try and hopefully get those ordinances banished. So under the PFA, or Pennsylvania Forest Products Association, is our Sustainable Forestry Initiative and the state implementation. I can't say it. The SIC, let's put it that way. The SIC is uses the TPO a lot because they are fully funded by the assessments that are from the mills, and the mills accurately having data on them where they're located is very important, and that they're still in business, because again, that's how we get our funding through the SFI. The SIC gets their funding through that, so it's very important for that. This is more of a regional. I know in Pennsylvania we have done a survey on our own, and we've asked the question for the SIC if a facility has a policy in place to use SFI trained loggers. And this is very important because that's the only place that this information could be found for our committee, was through that survey, was to ask that. So the information from the TPO for the SIC, it can't be found anywhere else. And we have one program manager for the SIC, and he's very busy because he does almost all of our training for loggers in Pennsylvania. So to have the TPO report and have all this information at one spot is very important for him. Next, I would like to talk about our Pennsylvania Hardwood Development Council. This is an important group in Pennsylvania. The Hardwood Development Council was formed in 1988, and it was made from the General Assembly, came up and said that we had to have a council like this. It would be very good for the industry. It's made up of 25 different members, and they are the Governor's Cabinet, General Assembly. We have lumber manufacturers on there, secondary manufacturers. We even have maple syrup representative on there, and township people also, and academia. And thing about this Hardwood Development Council is that they go all across the country and overseas to promote Pennsylvania hardwoods. And where they get all their information that they share in their pamphlets or talking to these lumber buyers in different countries is they get it from the TPO, and that's where they really use that TPO. One of the more of interesting things is that Pennsylvania, again, this is the Hardwood Development Woodmobile, and is under the HDC. This is a 34-foot trailer that's pulled around by that pickup truck there, and it goes to all different types of events, forestry events, agriculture fairs, and educational parts, and everywhere like that. And inside the Woodmobile is different things that they have in there, and the TPO supplies the data for that. So it's for the production rates and employment rates, the different residues and different products that we use. And the trailer was donated by one of our large mills in Pennsylvania, Deer Park Lumber. And then the truck was sponsored by 25 different members of Pennsylvania Forest Products Association. So it's very important for the TPO, and that's where this woodmobile goes. And it's very used in a lot of educational programs in our elementary schools or anywhere that we want to teach the public about harvesting or timber products in Pennsylvania. Another thing that the Hardwood Development Council uses the TPO in, and this is very important in Pennsylvania because we're dealing with a lot of timber harvesting ordinances happening. And every year at a convention called the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the HDC gets to present there and talk to all these local officials that are making decisions that are affecting the hardwood industry. So we can share the TPO information with them and show them what kind of impact the industry has in their small communities. And so it's very important that we can share that with people that are making ordinances that can be harmful to the industry, and they don't really realize it until they see some of the facts that come from the TPO. With the HDC, we share this information, and they have underneath them are the HUGs, which are hardwood utilization groups. And these hardwood utilization groups were also an idea from the General Assembly that we should have these groups and support them. And 80% of the Hardwood Development Council's budget has to go to these HUGs, and it's used for promoting the industry, employment opportunities, and sustainable forestry education. And so underneath that, we used to have 7 HUGs in Pennsylvania, and today we're lucky to have 3 of them, and they're very strong still in the state, but we just only have 3 now. The first one I'd like to talk to you about is the Allegheny Hardwood Utilization Group, or AHUG. AHUG is probably one of the main reasons why the Hardwood Development Council was even formed, because back in this group decided that, thought it would be really good to have a council and be able to promote the industry and have somebody to talk about the industry. But AHUG is in our Allegheny Plateau, or as most of you know, the Allegheny National Forest. That's their wood basket, and they're up there in some of the world's greatest cherry areas. So they're really dependent on FIA data and TPO data, again, because that Allegheny is their wood basket. They use the TPO information to lobby their local officials also to get the infrastructure that they needed, because there's not very good infrastructure out there. So they really use that information to help back their claims on that. And the group uses the TPO information to have a lot of historical data and show the importance of the industry in that area. The next association we have, and this is still again another HUG, is the NTHA, or Northern Tier Hardwood Association. This association is in our northeastern part of the state, up towards the New York area, and they cover 9 different counties there, and they're made up of secondary loggers, sawmills, and forestry and loggers all together there. And this group is they kind of focus on some promotional stuff, and they go to different lumber expos and logging conferences and that, and they get their information and share the TPO through the information there and from the TPO at those, and their pamphlets and things that they hand out there. And one thing, again, with the NTHA, like most of these HUGs there in our SIC, there's one program manager. So it's very important that they can get this TPO data and see the report, and it's at one single place. They can go quickly. Their budgets don't allow for them to have, a lot of people there. So just to be able to get something quickly and find it is very important to them, and just to have that historical data again. Our last HUG, which this is our newest HUG, and kind of was just formed in 2003. This Keystone Wood Products Association is located in central Pennsylvania. This is kind of what I like to call the sawmill mecca of Pennsylvania, because if you ever go do a TPO survey at some of these mills, you'll actually be driving down the driveway or the lane to get to a mill to conduct a survey, and you'll actually drive through somebody else's log yard or their operations. You have to watch out for a forklift coming through. But it makes getting the TPO surveys, a couple of them done in one day, really easy. But it's very interesting, all these mills in this area. So this group has 11 representation in 11 different counties. So it's pretty big area there for all the mills that are there. Keystone Wood Product Association is a little different than AHUG and the Northern Tier because they're focused more on the promotion and education of the wood product industry in Pennsylvania, but they still use the TPO information when they put grant proposals out there. And when they do these proposals, use the TPO to back their data. And also, again, I was talking about these timber harvest ordinances. This is one place that Keystone Wood Products really uses the TPO data because they want to talk to those officials and just tell them, these ordinances aren't going to work for us. And, think for what you're doing to that industry that's so important in your small community. This is kind of an interesting group here. This is called, we have the Penn York Lumbermen's Club. The Penn York Lumbermen's Club was formed by 4 different individuals. There's 2 of them from Pennsylvania and 2 of them from New York back in 1949. So they thought it would be a good idea to have a kind of a social club to talk with like-minded people and have them talk to each other, like about lumber manufacturing, employment issues, just people that had the same issues that they are having that they could talk to and interact and even have some ledger to talk about the regulatory effects that things are happening in the state back then. So in 1950, the club got going and they had 30 members. Today, we have over 150 different members in this association or this club, and they're really enthusiastic. The summertime, these events happen at least once a month, and we have people driving over 150 miles to come to these meetings, so they're pretty enthusiastic. The Penn York Lumbermen's Club really doesn't use the TPO, but these are the people that are the TPO. So to go there and talk to them and explain to them what we do, they tell us what TPO works, what information works for them, what they like to see, what they don't want to see. So it's just important for us to get out there and share with them the information from the TPO. Again, when they tell us what they don't like, it kind of leads us into what I like to call the good, the bad, and ugly. The good part of the TPO, there's way too much to talk to about that, but some of the things are, I hear from all the mills that we conduct TPO and have good relationships with is, it's good to hear use the employment rates, the production rates, even to be able to do a wood basket analysis from that TPO data and FIA is very important. And in the future, the residue is going to be very important also. So the bad part, well, let's face it, is getting the mills to do the survey, getting them to return the survey probably is just as hard as getting them to do it. I think this is more of a challenge than I think of anything. It's not really a bad thing, but it's a challenge. And after this conversation today and the past couple of days, I see, that we need to get the information out there quickly. Again, we said yesterday, we saw some of those tools that the other regions have, and it'd be really helpful here in Pennsylvania to have some of them tools that we can share that information with these groups, and they can get out there and talk to their members, and it just reinforces that willingness that why are they doing the TPO? So it's very helpful in that way. And then the ugly part, well, I don't know if this is ugly. Some of the biometricians and data analysis really love this part, but I can't stand it, is trying to, when you ask a new question, you have to tease that data out of there somehow and figure out how to do that reporting. And that to me is a real headache. And just having to figure out how to reorganize the TPO. So I think that's just an ugly thing. I think so. But to move forward, I think some of the questions that would be useful in the future would be to maybe talk about exporting to what countries. I know it's kind of personal information. If you don't want to ask them, what city in China do you export to, but kind of like what region or Vietnam, or kind of break it down into regions, because really exporting logs and lumber is starting to be an important part important aspect of the hardwood industry, especially here in Pennsylvania. So I think that would be something kind of good to talk about or see in the TPO. And I just want to kind of go over also why Pennsylvania does their TPO. And Pennsylvania, we have 17 million acres, and the Bureau of Forestry has 2.2 of that. And the Bureau does not have the ability, personnel, the funding, or anything to be able to sustainably harvest or regenerate our timber. And so we know we need to have that one-on-one, face-to-face with the industry and get out there and talk to them so they can come and help us harvest our timber and harvest our timber for us. Again, the mission statements I put up there for all those, if you noticed in those mission statements, somewhere, somehow, it said sustainable harvesting or sustainable forestry. And again, it goes back to that. If we do not have a strong industry in Pennsylvania, we'll never be able to regenerate our world-class timber or harvest that timber and get it out there and be used in wood products. So if we just don't have that, that's why we conduct a TPO, is just to make sure we have that reporting information and know how the industry is doing. And as you can see in our presentation, the TPO just doesn't stop at the mill. It trickles down the whole way through the whole entire state to all different people that use it. So I probably have a little bit of time left, and if we have any questions, I can take them. But if not, my information's there, and please feel free to contact me. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. There are a couple of quick questions in the chat. One about, do you ask ownership source on the TPO surveys in Pennsylvania?
We do not ask ownership. Again, 70% of our timber is owned by private. So pretty much we basically know it's owned by or it's harvested from the private.
Great. And then there's a question if you're the actual coordinator for the formation and sustainability of these hugs.
Actually, that's under the HDC, the Hardwood Development Council. That's where all their funding comes from. And so they really coordinate with them, and I work with those groups. So I'm the liaison between the Bureau of Forestry and all these different hugs and the council and the industry.
Great. And then Consuelo was interested if you had any examples of those handouts that you mentioned.
I can get some of them. I don't have any right offhand here, but I can definitely get some and share them with the group.
Awesome. Yeah, if you send them over, Cindy and I can get them on the website.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other follow-up to any of those questions or new questions for Ben while we have a minute or two? All right. In the meantime, Guy, you can go ahead and pull up your presentation. Or Claire, whoever's running the show.
Yep, we just had to change. Guy was going to be doing it, but he's having spotty internet, so I'm doing it. And I unfortunately was not the one who practiced. So give me just a second. Is this showing up okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
And Guy, are you on the phone?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know whether I'm getting a lot of spotty connection with you guys. The first time in my COVID experience now, I've lost internet before a major presentation. Can you hear me though?
Yep.
You can't hear me? Am I coming through clear or spotty?
I'm hearing you well, Guy.
All right, tell you what, I'm not hearing you so well. I think I'm getting some glitches here, but I'll go ahead and run through the presentation. You let me know if there's some problems, okay?
Okay, and you just tell me when you need me to advance the slides.
Yeah, I will do so. I didn't hear the last part of that sentence, but I will tell you when to advance the slides. Okay, we'll start out. And this was slide one, so don't advance the slide yet. Hello, everybody. I work for the Forest Service, where I am, among other things, responsible for international and national reporting for forest statistics, including wood products. I will be sharing this presentation with my colleague, Claire Udi, who heads up the RPA assessment, which I know many of you are familiar. And I wanted to thank Consuelo Brandes and Sonia Oswald for their helpful input to this talk and to my work in general. Okay, before starting, I wanted to emphasize that we are talking about national aggregate statistics for reporting at national and international levels. Now, the broad scale doesn't imply increased importance. In fact, sometimes it's just the opposite. But at the same time, it does mean we have to shift gears a little bit. In general, consistency and comprehensive coverage across time and space are a paramount concern here. Next slide, please. And I'm not seeing the slide advance. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes,
we're
I
good, Guy.
think.
If you, oh, sorry. Yeah, if you want to turn off your video, that might help you as well.
All right. Okay. Yes.
Slide
Okay.
has
Good
advanced.
idea.
Yep.
Thank you. I will do that. Okay, it's advanced for you. It hasn't advanced for me, so we'll just wing it. It's a good thing this time I did write out my my talk beforehand. Okay, so slide two. This is an overview slide. My aim in this overall presentation is to first describe the Forest Service's main national and international wood products reporting requirements. Second, generally assess our ability to meet these requirements. And third, explore possible ways to reconstitute our capacity to produce comprehensive and consistent national statistics on a permanent basis, along with the possible ways TPO can help with that. At the end of my presentation, I'll be passing the microphone to Claire, who will talk about TPO and the RPA assessment. Slide 3, please. And let me know when it's changed, because I've got a lag here. All right, okay, but first, some background. I see aggregate wood product statistics as a public good, at least at the scale that we present them and what's presented by the Forest Service. This doesn't mean that proprietary information is not important, but at the level that I work at, it's mostly a public good sort of thing, especially at our scale of aggregation. We don't have to worry about confidentiality and related stuff. As such, the Forest Service has a responsibility to provide these statistics because, as public goods, the more available they are, the better for everyone. And in fact, we have this responsibility, and in fact, our statistical reports have been very popular. It's one of our most popular downloads, as I'll show in a little bit. But gathering and consolidating and publishing these statistics is a complex, time-consuming, and expensive endeavor. Also, providing these stats, particularly in national aggregate, is mostly the work of Forest Service scientists, and outside of FIA, this work is not very sexy or rewarding for scientists from a career standpoint. The value of statistics also is often enhanced by repetition over time and space, but given recent retirements in the Forest Service, we are having a hard time maintaining overall capacity in statistical reporting for wood products and consistent time series in particular. Next slide, please. Let me know.
Should be good.
Okay, hang on a second. Okay, now I got it. What's going on here? Okay, so a little bit of history. Well, actually, I'm still seeing background. You guys should be seeing history, right? The Howard report. Yeah, there we go. Okay, this brings us to the Forest Service's main report on wood products, and that is the U.S. Timber Production, Trade, Consumption, and Price Statistics Report, otherwise known as the Howard Report. This publication was produced by the Forest Products Lab on a regular basis, and the pub and its associated data tables constitute the primary source of U.S. aggregate stats on wood products. The title doesn't sound all that exciting, but I want to point out that this is among FS or Forest Service Research and Development's most downloaded publications. Unfortunately, James Howard retired in 2019, and the Forest Service is looking to replace the lost capacity, but firm plans have not yet emerged. In the meantime, we've been relying on ad hoc work to meet some of our most pressing wood products reporting requirements and data calls. Now, I note throughout the beginning parts of this session today, for example, Nadia had a bunch. She referenced the Howard report and included a lot of the other people who have worked out of the FPL on this type of statistical reporting exercises. That whole unit has pretty much retired, including Ken Skog. And so this is one of the gaps right now that we're looking to fill. Next slide, please. Let me know when it's up.
Should be up.
Okay, good. Okay, also I should point out that there are a number of regional reporting efforts, some of which I'm aware, others not. But the one that I'm most aware of is the quarterly report out of the Pacific Northwest. I believe Gene Daniels is on the call, on the call today. And Gene was instrumental in keeping that together after Deb Warren retired. It's been, for in my case, it was a Bible, basically. I spent a lot of hours working with those reports back in the 1990s, and it has been going on for a long time now. But it too has been plagued by retirements and moving on of staff. The PNW Research Station is working to update the series and deliver those series via their website. But their ability to continue to do so in the future is unclear. Now, Gene, I think, put some sort of an update on that. And maybe in the chat box, you could say that if there's more that you can say about this, that would be great, especially if I'm wrong about this unclear future thing. Also, there are various other public and private sources of wood product statistics, notably TPO, but none of these efforts provide the sort of consolidated data products that are needed to address national level reporting needs in a comprehensive fashion. And by comprehensive fashion, I mean something that is consistent throughout and is also, how should I say, meeting materials balancing concerns and things like that. Okay, next slide, please.
Got it?
Let me know.
Go ahead, Guy.
Okay, and that brings us to the question of what do these, I am going ahead. Hope you can hear me. And that brings us to the question of what do these reporting requirements actually entail? There are various reporting vehicles, including United Nations regular statistical reports, inputs on wood energy and carbon and harvested wood products at the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And this speaks back to some of the things that Michael was talking about, and also Elaine, and various queries for other international environmental and trade processes. And finally, Forest Service national reports such as the National Report on Sustainable Forests or the RPA assessment. And I will note that Steve Prisley and Bob App both talked about pellets. One of the places where we use this information is in trade negotiations and interactions, for example, with our European counterparts who are looking for sustainability assurance relative to those pellets. And the information that we were able to produce was very important, but at the same time, it was a one-time deal. And hopefully those pellet time theories are going to be something that's going to be available easily and public-facing in the future for the country as a whole. Wood energy is a tough one, though. All right, next slide, please. Let me know.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't have time to go into detail on all of those various outputs, but I do want to focus my attention on the UN Economic Commission for Europe's Joint Forest Sector Query. The acronym is quite long for that whole thing, but it's will be just called the JFSQ for short. And I'm doing this because it is the most comprehensive and rigorous of our wood products reporting requirements. By the way, the USA is a member country in UNECE, but I won't explain why. It's a leftover from World War II, basically. In any case, the JFSQ feeds into UNFAO, which is the world's primary data reporting facility on forest and wood products, and it can serve as an excellent foundation for our overall wood products statistical reporting, at least at the national level, and making allowances for metric conversions, of course. And one thing to point out here is if the US can't produce good statistics on wood products, we really can't go around the world and ask places like Brazil or Sierra Leone to do so. So this, I think this one is quite an important report out. Now, I know you can't read this table, the table on there. I didn't, but I wanted to put this up just to give you an idea of the scope of the JFSQ. There are multiple tables here covering the production and trade of a comprehensive list of wood products. Note that secondary wood products, including panels and trade flows, are included, areas that are not generally covered by TPO. Also, the JFSQ contains a check on material balances between inputs and outputs, as well as various conversion factors. And additionally, wood energy and engineered wood products are included in separate but related queries. So it really does cover the whole scope of forest product production. The JFSQ is an annual exercise with considerable complexity and time requirements. Every year in March, I receive the query and happily I send it out to James Howard, but more recently to Consuelo Brandes or Marcus Taylor, who have done really an excellent job covering a difficult task to tight timelines. I really appreciate the work they've done on that. They tell me that they've learned a lot from the process and from interacting with the project manager in Geneva. His name is Alex McCusker. He's an American and he has extensive wood products experience. And also I have to wonder when he's going to retire because it's probably going to be fairly soon. Next slide, please. And let me know. All right, there are also a number of USA domestic reporting processes that rely in part on good wood product statistics. One is the RPA assessment. Claire will be talking about that in a few minutes. The one I'm most familiar with is the National Report on Sustainable Forests, which reports out on 54 different indicators of forest sustainability, including 20 indicators in the socioeconomic realm. They include production and trade and wood product statistics, which was amply covered by the Howard Report and more recently by our JFSQ reporting. But there are many other economic indicators that fall outside of the box, such as stats for non-timber wood products, which is also covered by TPO under the work of Jim Chamberlain, but doesn't have a full data set to be reported. It's a data poor area, but one that has a great deal of interest. And also forest sector employment. In terms of policy relevance, employment stands out, and we are routinely asked to provide statistics on national level employment for the forest sector as a whole, but we don't currently have a definitive established report to cite in this regard, and our employment numbers reporting is somewhat haphazard as a result. We end up providing different numbers at different times, depending on what sort of definition people choose to include when they're looking at the various industry codes to code forest employment. Next slide, please. Let me know.
Go ahead.
All right, thanks. Over the last few slides, I've described some of the major data reporting needs for national level forest product statistics. Meeting these needs and related needs requires a concerted effort on the part of the Forest Service. Ideally, we will reconstitute a durable reporting structure, something like what we had out of the FPL, the Forest Products Lab, in the previous decades, one that combines various data inputs to produce a comprehensive database that can then be used to meet our reporting requirements, including general distribution to the public at large. The crux of this problem is the data processing and analysis needed to produce the base data. This work requires a specific set of knowledge and skills, as well as native talent. And it takes institutional commitment to nurture and sustain these skills over the long run. Next slide, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, conclusion. To conclude, when I first started in this business, I thought that data would always be improving. But over the years, I've been surprised to find that certain key data sets that I'd long relied upon were discontinued. This seems to be happening all the time. And I realize that developing and delivering data doesn't happen by itself and can't be taken for granted. This certainly applies to forest sector production and related economic data. Regarding wood products reporting at national scale, the Forest Service is increasingly challenged by retirements without specific hires to replace them. We've been able to meet our major reporting requirements through ad hoc arrangements, particularly through the hard work of people in FIA and TPO in particular. But there's no guarantee that these people will be available to do the work in the future. And perhaps more importantly, our public-facing data delivery has languished. A permanent solution is sorely needed. Given its extensive experience working with the wood products industry and wood product statistics, and its mandate to deliver information to the public, TPO should play an important part in developing the solution, particularly in the crux area of data consolidation and analysis. This would be either in a leadership role or maybe in collaboration with other units. Obviously, other units would be working, but I think TPO has a really an important role to play here. Thanks very much. I'm glad I was able to get through this presentation, and I'll turn it over to Claire now. If there's questions in the chat, I seem to be getting chat, so I'll keep a monitor on that and see what comes up. Go ahead, Claire.
Thanks, Guy. You really highlighted the big picture as well as some of the critical issues that we're facing. I'm going to do a quick deeper dive on the RPA assessment, which uses and reports out on TPO information in a variety of ways. For those of you who aren't familiar with the RPA assessment, it's a recurring assessment conducted by the Forest Service to meet legislative requirements. Congress passed the Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act in 1974 due to concerns over resource scarcity. The legislation requires a national report on the conditions and trends of renewable resources on all forests and rangelands every 10 years. And this report is the RPA, or Resources Planning Act assessment. And in addition to the required decadal assessment, we also produce a mid-cycle update. Ultimately, the RPA assessment provides a snapshot of current U.S. forest and rangeland resource conditions and trends. It identifies drivers of change, specifically looking at the interaction of economic, social, and biophysical factors, and projects our resources 50 years into the future. Now, here's a list of the resources that are being examined as part of the 2020 RPA assessment. You can see how broad our scope is, but thinking specifically about how TPO data and information contributes to the RPA assessment, I wanted to highlight these three resource areas: forest resources, forest products, and forest carbon. TPO provides us information about current status and past trends that we can summarize and share with our readers, which include land managers and policymakers. And the information is also integral to our modeling efforts, which allow us to make projections about getting the feedback. Projections about the future of these resources, which are also used to support management and policy decisions. A key publication that's part of the RPA assessment and contains TPO information is the Forest Resources Report. This report is essentially a roll-up of forest inventory and analysis data and is published in advance of every RPA assessment and update. Our last Forest Resources Report was published in early 2019. And Chapter 5 contains TPO information and is focused on forest products and services. This information is used by states and Congress for official reporting purposes and to support funding and policy decisions. I also want to highlight another RPA publication that was just released in January. This report provides status and trends for the U.S. forest products sector. Information from this publication is incorporated into our forest products modeling system, ensuring that our U.S. global forest product markets and trade model input data match up and allocating production across RPA regions. Annual data that are gathered consistently across the U.S. improve our ability to report on the use of the nation's timber resources and ensure that Congress and the global community are correctly informed. But these are the broad categories of ways that TPO contributes to the RPA assessment. I've already mentioned through the two recent publications the contributions to monitoring so that we can figure out trends and the role of the U.S. forest products sector. The data also contributes to market analysis research as we seek to understand how these markets work and determine market efficiency, scarcity, and price information. Our information about trends can be layered onto our understanding of markets to help us do forecasting and make projections about how markets will change and ultimately possibly reshape our forests. And we can similarly use these models and projections to get a better understanding of how existing policies have affected markets and how new policies might affect markets going forward. Ultimately, forest economics research depends heavily on good production data, which serves as a key dependent variable. TPO information is really critical to the work that we do in terms of both monitoring and research. Increasingly, questions focus more on where, in addition to historic questions which focus on how much. And it's worth noting that current availability of production data is a limiting factor for this body of work and research. Delving into the RPA framework just a bit more, here I show how we take forest inventory information along with projections we've developed for climate, population, and economic factors as inputs into our modeling framework, which is highlighted in red. We have 3 models that communicate with one another to investigate forest dynamics, land use, and forest products. The Forest Resource Outlook model, or FORUM, has replaced our previous model, the Global Forest Products model. These models produce future projections for wood products, forest inventory, and land use, which in turn feed into our other resource projections, including water, wildlife, and carbon, just to name a few. For those of you who may have been familiar with our previous forest products modeling efforts, I wanted to highlight the new FORUM model and the differences with GFPM. Our new framework allows for flexible producing and consuming locations. It models primary and processed products, provides 5-year solutions, but can be run as an annual version, and incorporates hardwood and softwood logs and lumber, as well as wood pellets into its structure. Our work benefits from a well-defined, nationally consistent data generation process. We need precise, complete, and detailed estimates of wood product outputs that are linked to timber product inputs and timber harvests. The finer the spatial and temporal resolution of the data, the better, although we understand the trade-off between the two. All of our work is supported by accurate estimates of production at all levels and at different scales. The TPO information is critical to our work, and we support future enhancements and improvements in these areas. Getting into the weeds for just a second, our work would also benefit from more information about harvested wood product carbon pools, as well as an improved understanding of the quantity of saw timber-sized trees going to pulpwood or bioenergy and fuel wood, and how this has changed over time. So I hope you can see from both Guy and myself just how important TPO information and the TPO program is, and how it helps us fulfill national reporting obligations and create a clear vision for Congress and the international community about the current and future status of our forest resources. I hope we've left you with some thoughts about current and future capacity issues, data gaps, and possible improvements, along with the understanding that as users and supporters of this data, we would be happy to work together to realize these enhancements in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire and Guy. We're going to move into our discussion section, but does anyone have any specific questions for Claire or Guy while I pull up one of our favorite polls? Feel free to chime in. If not, I might ask Rich to step in and narrate for a bit until I pull up this poll.
Sure, happy to do that. While Danielle's pulling up the polls, I'd like to go back to some earlier questions in the chat. And one of the questions after the first couple of presentations by Nadia and Michael were, do we need different TPO surveys for different types of mills? And I'm interested in what attendees might think about that. Please use your smiley face to raise your hand so we can see who it is that I'd like to respond.
Go ahead, Steve, jump in.
Yeah, so and I'm not sure I'm the best to answer. I think it'd be nice to hear from some of the TPO program folks that to some extent we already do. To my knowledge, for example, the pulp mill survey is handled a little bit differently than some of the others. And I would definitely see logic for a different survey based maybe on mill size, for example, that would separate the real small sawmill operations from the larger ones and would be a lot simpler or something like that. I would see good justification for that.
Hi, Bill. Go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But I do think that some of the questions that have come up and comments that have come up this afternoon, we really need to evaluate the data elements that we need, which could be modeled. And then I think Brett had some interesting comments about maybe they start with the same core questionnaire or survey form, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same for everything, but you kind of scale it back. But I think the first question is to make sure we're asking the right questions, we're collecting the right data, and are there other ways to get some of that information? Once we get there, then I think we can start figuring out what needs to be in the form, what doesn't need to be in the form, etc. I think, to me, I would put what we should be getting first, the information needed first, then let's worry about the form.
Oh, sorry, Rich, I muted you. We could hear you typing.
Any other reaction to the question or to the comments that Steve and Bill just made?
We have Kristen.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, thanks. I guess, Ron Piva could talk to this probably better than I can, but we have done that on the sawmill survey in the north. We've differentiated the survey by size of mills, and we've also done it by mill specific type. And what we found was that it led to even more confusion and not necessarily any better response rate. So just as an observation.
Okay.
Yep, and since Kristen brought me up, I'll go ahead and kind of back up what Kristen said, was that it could get into kind of a trying to keep which forms, which mills get which forms can be a problem. When we're dealing with 1,000 mills that are getting a survey just in the north, and we have 3 or 4 different forms that we have to get to. And there was kind of mentioned that the pulp survey is different than the other mill surveys. It's pretty much the same survey. They just get a couple extra questions. What do they do? What do they bring any mill residues that they use? And at least for the north, we kind of also ask how much comes in whole tree chips and peeled roundwood. The sawmills don't get that question, and the pulp mills get that question, but they've been getting it for so many years that most of them already know how to fill it out. So,
Ron, when you said that there are nearly 1,000 mills in the northern region, is that your sample population? Or
that is our sample population. Yeah, that's our sample population. We have over 3,000 mills that are on our mill list. So.
Ooh.
All right, Todd.
Thank you. Yeah, in the western states, we have used separate forms for different types of mills, kind of like Ron mentioned. We've been using for mills like a biomass energy plant or a pulp mill or an MDF or particle board plant that may use a mix of roundwood or mill residues or other types of wood inputs. We use a different form for that type of mill than we do, say, a sawmill or a veneer plant or even a post and pulp facility that uses just roundwood. And we've experimented over the years with using, I don't know, experiment might be too strong a word. We've tested or tried using different forms for individual mills. And it does get more challenging when you're surveying more frequently and you have more mills to survey. And there's also are you getting all the data elements you need on every single form, and can they go into the data system? So there's that in the weeds stuff that goes along with that complexity of But now we're down to basically two basic forms that we try to use among the Western states when we survey. And we do collect information on, try to collect information on employment and also the outputs from the mills, those primary products, you know, how much lumber they made, how much veneer they made, as a way to kind of link that log consumption with the outputs and the mill residue. So we have all three components.
Thanks, Todd.
Yep, sure thing, Rich.
Dave?
I just want to put in another plug for the smart survey system. I think that, you know, rather than different surveys, you know, if we had a survey system that could be administered by internet and rely on some kind of a database to pre-populate some of the more mundane fields like contact information, equipment type, it could speed them through the survey and make it a lot simpler. Some of the questions aren't as relevant if your roundwood is purchased, you know, in board feet. You don't have to have you don't have to go through those boxes for, you know, the green tons conversion to quartz. You know, if you're a biomass energy plant, you know, and there could be some smart decision making in a survey system that simplifies the survey for those biomass energy plants, because they don't pretty much know, you know, they're furnished by species. They pretty much know it into hardwood and softwood groups, and they might know a procurement radius. But you know, all of that finished product stuff, you know, all of those boxes don't need to be checked. The equipment can be much simplified for biomass energy plants. So there's some mill types that, you know, could be a lot simpler for if you know, some smart decision making, you know, could occur as they enter data.
Good, thanks. Are there other questions out there for any of the presenters?
Well, in the meantime, while you all are thinking, I'm going to pull up this poll, and I had to wait to cut in because this poll is a little more complicated, and it's a ranking exercise. So before you put in your answers, make sure you scroll down and read all 5 options first, because you're going to rank them 1 through 5. 1 being not important, and then 5 being the most important. So I'm going to pop that up, but I just wanted to note that since it's a little different from the polls the other day. So here we go.
Hi, Danielle. This is Jean Daniels. I'm having a little trouble understanding how this poll works, because if you're ranking 1 to 5 for things from A to B and only 2 things have something identified there, like how?
Yeah, you should be able to see that A is 1 and E is 5. So you're just picking, so whatever the first category is that the most important to you? So pick 1 and then go down from there. But you have to read all 5 of them first to decide how you're going to answer. But A should be.
Oh, so between these 5 things, we rank them from 1 to 5.
Yes, that's what I was saying. You got to read all 5 of the options, all 5 of the questions first, so that you can.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, the survey tools on WebEx are not as advanced as most.
Yeah, I hear you.
You can't do a ranking within each. So I had to do it this way.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Yep. Tom, go ahead and jump in. I think, people can do two things at once, hopefully.
Walk and chew gum. There's been a lot of talk of how much saw timber is actually going to pulpwood. I think you're going to see that number go up. I know in my experience working for a logger before I came on board with Maryland Forest Service, I worked at a sawmill many years ago as well, and I'm looking at what I was, what we were loading to take to the pulp mill, and I'm seeing way more saw timber on there than what we would have considered pulpwood 25 years ago. So I think that that's going to be an ever increasing number.
And then I'll open it up, and Michael, if you want to verbalize your your call for collaboration, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I was simply saying that there's an opportunity for us to try to figure out some of the technology side of this and figure out ways that we can develop a more collaborative system, or at least learn from each other to do some of the data collection a little bit differently, a little bit better. I know, for example, AWC actually just put out an RFP to tackle the sort of an online type of system, and I'd like to get it beyond sort of a paper form that's online and get to some of the suggestions that David Newman was making in terms of making it, pre-populate and find some of the data in advance. And again, as I mentioned during my talk, maybe even things like integrating into accounting systems and those kinds of pieces, again, to try to see if we can reduce that burden. If there's a small group of people that want to discuss this, I'd be happy to coordinate it. And at the endowment, we might even have some funding to sort of facilitate it a little bit further. So be happy to try to figure that out if there's a group of folks that wants to take me up on it.
Great, thank you, Michael. I think Scott has his hand up.
Just like to say, I think the electronic option is a great way to go for many folks. We do have a strong non-connected Amish contingent that would be left out. So whatever we do, we can't leave them out because they're chewing up wood and making products. So we're going to have to go and still use a paper method. And I mean, there are different sectors and there's different sects within them that use mechanization and things like that, but there are folks that don't. So just wanted to mention that, Michael.
And Rich, I just shared the poll results. You can see those. I don't know if you want to walk us through some of that, if that's helpful.
Sure. Interesting. The first, now let me just scroll down to them quickly. There's a fair distribution of responses. Let me focus in on question 2. That question had, that's I think accounting for harvested wood products from disturbance events. Generally, that received low priority to medium priority. In contrast, supporting carbon and climate goals received quite a bit more support. There was nobody who considered that to be unimportant. But the, sorry, I'm getting there. But improvements for carbon accounting were considered very important by 17, 4 out of 5 important by another 12. And so, 29 of 64 consider that to be very highly important. 29 out of, when you take away the no answers, 29 out of 44 ranked that very high. The other one that ranked high was improved accounting for timber flow for domestic and international markets. Nearly half of the people who responded considered that to be very important, or next to most important. So I think that's significant. Carbon and international markets come out as the strong priorities here. Does anybody have any comments about the poll results?
I also encourage you all, if there are things that weren't listed as emerging needs, to put those in the chat. Don't forget about that. So I know we only had to ask 5, but if there's others that aren't in there, feel free to throw that in the chat. And then I can't tell if the hands are still up or if they're from before. So if Tom or Scott wants to jump in, or if that was from before. And Dave, you sort of had your hand up for a second. It went back down. But.
Yeah, this is Dave Newman. I was a little confused about number 5. I'm assuming that meant analysis of and projections based on TPO data.
All right, just in the interest of time, I'm going to pop up the poll for the CFEs, but we can, feel free to keep the discussion going if folks are interested. So I don't want to cut that short. I know that Guy has his hand up.
Guy, please share with us what your comment is.
Hi, thanks. It seems like I'm back on my regular connection now, so I think it's better. I'm hearing you guys fine. My comment is about, you stressed the carbon accounting, and Michael and Elaine talked about it earlier. One of the things I think we run into is that a lot of the accounting seems to be on a life cycle analysis basis or particular project level type work, and trying to come up with broad scale sort of national policy relevant estimates of potential sequestered carbon in wood products. I don't know if that's been developed to the same degree, and yet that's something that would be really useful in arguments, and basically, moving the ball forward in terms of wood products in a carbon friendly or a climate friendly future.
Good, thanks, Guy.
Any other wrap-up thoughts? Otherwise, I do want to do a plug for tomorrow. I know it's a shorter session, but I do want to make sure folks know that's an important session to come back to, because here's where we're going to report out some of the initial thoughts that we have on recommendations and action items. So we need your help in making sure that's a complete and accurate list. So I just a pitch for tomorrow, but I'll let Rich jump in.
Good, yes. There will be a bunch of work behind the scenes tonight and early tomorrow morning to try to sort through everything that's been heard and identify the 6 to 12 messages that were heard repeatedly.
Awesome. Any other wrap-up thoughts from Steve or anyone else?
I think I might add, I think the thing that would also be helpful as we go through those recommendations, clearly there's a lot of regional variation in both the situation and the importance. My comments on modeling sourcing of wood doesn't apply very well out west, where a lot of wood goes by rail, for example, according to some of the comments. So I think your attendance tomorrow will be helpful as we start discussing some of these results to maybe get some feedback, what regions seem to be, maybe different people in different regions would prioritize some of these differently. And maybe, I don't know if there's something we can do in a poll, but we certainly want to get that feedback. I don't think any of us believes there's a one size fits all, and we need to have regional flexibility. So.
Thanks, Steve. We can definitely think through that to make up a quick poll for that. We do have, yeah, we don't have that covered, but yeah. Anyway, other than that, anybody else have any questions? Scott, do you want to say something?
I was just curious. I know at the first day we went over some of the questions and the responses, and there was unity in some areas that they all seem to fill out. Did we really dive into the ones that aren't? I mean, as far as we know, there's low response rate, but is there going to be any discussion with that question, or why it may not be why the response is low, or I mean, from folks that go out and ask these questions to these people, or try to to bird dog that and see? I mean, will we learn anything from those questions that we should apply into the future? Some of them
You're saying that those questions, you mean that we asked in the poll questions?
Oh, no, sir. No, sir. I would be more, the gal got on, I think from the East, and she had mentioned, I forget her name, I'm sorry, but she studies the questions and what
Oh, right.
There was a lot there per se. And I just was wondering if the questions that have low response across the nation, would that teach us something about what we're doing, what we're asking, maybe what we need to change? That just was my point.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think maybe the non-response team in TPO is probably looking at things like that, or should if they're not.
Yeah, like some of these guys just skip these questions, and I don't know if it's because they don't understand it, or if it's because they don't want to share. So I mean, it's always that question, but yet they just don't seem to do it. So why is that?
Yeah, or they don't have the data for it, or whatever
That's
other
true.
reasons.
That's true. Some of these guys are just happy to see wood on their decks. They don't ask. They just pay a flat rate. I know with procurement in a mill, you pay distance and mileage, but that's a little more of a sophisticated procurement system. So that makes it easier to, and they do track it by computers. But the Amish, they don't have computers. They don't track their wood. They're just happy to see it so they can saw for the day. I'm not trying to make it simple. I'm just saying what I see. So thank you.
Do any of the other state attendees have the same kinds of support in their states for things like the Pennsylvania Hardwood Development Council that Ben reported on, or those sorts of outreach activities through lumbermen's associations?
Here in Maryland, we have the Maryland Forest Association and another group, the American Forest Association, but that's the only two organizations. We do have the Mountain Loggers Association over in Western Maryland, but as far as big forest groups, yeah, that's it. The Maryland Forest Association is the biggest.
Thanks, Tom. What about some of the other northern states or some of the western states? Are those kinds of associations and clubs commonly found in your neck of the woods? David Newman.
I think Ben has been extremely successful with his associations. The rest of us, I don't think, have that many.
Okay.
We have been working with several of the Western wood products, not the WWPA per se, but wood products associations in Western states. Colorado is one, California, Montana, of course, Idaho. Trying to reach out to folks that know their industry and have contacts with them to help check the mill list, let them know that we're working with them, that we have their sort of say stamp of approval to talk with them and why we're collecting the data, how it would be used, reassure them of the security of that information that they provide in the surveys. Yeah, it's something we work on and continue to do.
Good, thanks, Todd.
Can I say something about the non-response issue?
Sure.
What I have found from my personal experience in knowing the local mill owners anyway, even the loggers, they see us as an intrusion. Their information, they deem it as proprietary, and they're like, what does the government need to know how much I saw, how many trees I took in during the course of the year? Is this going to be a way that you can tax me on something else? That's how some of them actually see it. If you know, and again, the question has been asked, well, what do you do with the information after I give it to you? So I think marketing this way better than what it has been is definitely a huge need.
Thanks. Ben?
Yeah, I want to say that same thing, kind of go off what Tom said there too. It kind of goes back to the tools that the South region has, and you saw how there's different tools and how useful they were. I think that's if we can show the mills that we have those products, and that's what we're using the TPO for is to produce these products, and it's more useful for them, they're going to be more apt to come and do the TPO. And like Tom said, my truck, I have nothing that says DCNR on it except for one license plate and says municipality. Other than that, they don't know who I am. But when you pull in there, if I go with a service forester and they have DCNR all over it, you should see all the employees in the mill just kind of like starting to mumble under their breath. We're getting in trouble. Well, Jim, the owner, is going to be put in jail now. So it really goes back to that, like, what are they getting out of them doing a survey? So I think that's really important that we get those tools out there and that the mills can use this stuff. And so I think that's important. Good point, Tom.
Ben, I can actually see those faces with that look on it, and the guy's just saying, oh my God, what's going to happen now? But did I actually understand you to say, Ben, that your economic development people in PA use the TPO information for economic development purposes?
Yep. Yeah. I actually just did a wood basket analysis just back at Christmas time for a company trying to come into Pennsylvania from Europe. So, yep, they do. And
that is just way too cool. I spent 8 years as an elected official in Dorchester County where I live. And of course, I've worked in the commercial fisheries industries in my younger years and worked in I'm a fifth generation timber industry person by heritage. But anyway, what I found is that economic development, forestry is not on their radar here in Maryland. It's only been recently that we've actively been, getting in with the economic development people and showing them what we are and what we do. Because they're more geared towards the high tech and the high end manufacturing jobs. They don't look at us, as being of high value. But I mean, the forest industry in Maryland makes a huge economic contribution. Not just in at mill jobs, but the ancillary jobs that it supports as well.
I saw Mark Rosenberg had a hand up.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I just wanted to echo that some of our associations aren't real enamored and aren't sure what they get from TPO reports. They see some benefits, but not a lot. And I feel like they feel they have a better pulse on the industry in the state, than national reports, mill census information. Todd does work with them, so he may have a better perspective, but it's hard to enlist them in going too far out of their way, although they are in general supportive. And I think that probably transfers to the mills too, if you can show benefits, or if we can aim benefits at them from the TPO, develops information that is of interest to them, that we'll probably get better responses. It's kind of a no duh. But
Mark, do you or Nadia see opportunities in California that might be captured?
Well, in California, we fund and work with the university system to support a mill survey as well. It's a little less formal, and certainly doesn't have to go through the Office of Management and Budget review, but from that we can support some information for TPO as well. So we send them some information from mills that we work with that maybe the TPO hadn't reached out to yet, or wasn't in the annual survey. So we do look for those opportunities. And when you're on the ground and able to speak with them one-on-one, it's a lot more productive. And yeah, sometimes you don't get all of the boxes filled, but you get a good sense. And then the ones that we don't visit through that project, a lot of them get a phone call every year to make sure, see if they're operating, and that sort of thing. So we try to keep opportunities open for improving survey.
Good, thanks. Other comments or questions that people would like to make?
I see Brett and then Elaine.
Good, Brett?
Hi, so I just wanted to put in a quick plug for Dillman. So there's a methodology out there called the Dillman methodology that actually addresses a lot of the issues that people are bringing up here. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but there's something called social exchange theory, where we start talking about what are the benefits, what are the potential barriers, and all of this stuff, and it just provides a nice framework that we can use. And there's also a framework within there where we can be testing all of the survey instruments using the cognitive interview methodology or other methodologies. And so I think that there'll probably be some benefits just going back to basics for some of the issues that are being put forth. Thank you, Rich.
Next.
So, Rich, I think that was with me. This is Elaine. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. When we started doing the mill surveys for Quorum, a lot of that was built on personal relationship. People who knew the industry or had contacts in the industry were able to get those first surveys through. Now, this is early 2000s. We didn't get as much coverage as we do now, because now we are working with the organizations, with timber marketing organizations, and they do that heavy lifting for us, and they're the ones that are selling the benefits of providing this kind of data. And I think without that sales pitch on the part of the organizations, for example, it could be a Western Wood Products Association or APA or Composite Panel Association, without them actually providing that open door, we don't get very much. And so to me, it's maybe we can do some of this social theory stuff that Brett's talking about, but I think it's really important to build those relationships and to keep them consistent, because people don't want to give you their information unless they see, number one, they trust you, and number two, they see that it's going to be used in a way that's beneficial to them, but also doesn't hurt them. Because so often they see that, especially coming from the government. So those are just thoughts to try to wrap around how do you approach this in terms of building a system. And that's where I think, Michael's offer there of let's see how we can work together would be very, very powerful. So that's just my pitch.
Good, thanks. About 10 or 12 years ago, I worked with the Rocky Mountain Station director at the time on chains of influence regarding FIA information. And at that time, the unit based in Ogden had done some work with several national forests over the use of FIA data to make better choices of where to do elk habitat improvement activities. And those turned out very well. The forests were really happy about it. And so the director and I started to think through, well, how can we leverage that success? And one of the ways that emerged was talking to a vice president in the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, who the station director had a personal relationship with, and say, hey, I want to make you aware of how our FIA program has helped improve elk habitat improvement choices on national forests in Montana. And then would it be possible for you to go and become an advocate for the FIA program? Although you're a wildlife group, would you be willing to provide us some support across Idaho and Montana with elected officials? And that worked out very nicely. So sometimes doing a little strategic thinking about what the chains of influence might be. You know, who are the people that certain congressmen or senators listen to? And then which NGOs have their ear? And then how can we put information about FIA and TPO into the right hands of those influencers to leverage influence? Sometimes I think we don't do that often, that kind of strategic thinking about chains of influence well enough or often enough. My 2 cents. If there are no other comments, I think we're coming down to the time when we'll close off today's session. Would anybody like to have a last word?
Oh, here Jean wants a last word.
Oh, good.
I know I've been putting a lot of ideas in the chat, but I would argue, you know, I just moved out of our Forest Service R&D into the National Forest System in Alaska. And I would argue that not only, you know, the push for R&D to become more relevant to the National Forest System, compounded by, oh, why are you shaking your head, Rich?
I'm sorry, that's a little bit of involuntary tremor. I'm developing in my
oh darn, I'm sorry about that.
in my youth.
I'm sorry to call you out about that. Oh gosh, I'm terrible. Anyway, back on my thing here. That the Forest Service itself internally is a stakeholder group for TPO data. I think this is really untapped, especially in the West. I don't hear, when people talk about FIA in the West, they talk about the plots. Nobody talks about mill data. I think that the efforts to market the work from TPO would be extremely valuable, but I think you could even start within the agency to use it, maybe target some of the timber sale administrators and some of the directors who are in charge of putting together timber programs at the regions would be really useful for to get the word out about TPO. And in addition, a lot of the national forests have these collaborative groups now. We go and talk to them all the time about various projects and science and various things that are going on. And I could say for sure that those groups would be very interested to know about TPO data. And they also contain, you know, these groups are comprised of mill people and public officials, especially county commissioners. And this would be a great way at a local level to be able to market the work that's being done with TPO. I think TPO is unbelievably important. It's one of the only sources of forest sector data that we have in Alaska at all. And I am, you know, a little disappointed to hear that you guys are not having a good time or an easy time with being able to market the usefulness and the relevance of the work for TPO more and more widely. So
Anyway, I would just encourage everyone to maybe think about that for tomorrow's sessions. How can TPO demonstrate relevance to the National Forest System? Thank you.
Good point.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good one to end the day with. I don't see any other hands up. So we'd invite everybody back tomorrow for the start of the program and hear what